Welcome, weary traveler of the night, to another episode from At Hollow Midnight, where we delve into the delightfully unthrilling. If you find yourself enjoying these gentle meanderings through history's forgotten corners and absurd footnotes, do consider joining our quiet collective by subscribing. Your silent companionship is always appreciated. Tonight we unfurl a particularly peculiar tapestry, the first thread of which begins with a final flourish. Chapter 1. The Jester's final performance, the chill wind of late autumn, carrying the faint earthy scent of damp straw, and the more immediate acrid tang of human anticipation, snaked its way through the cobbled square of Eldoria. Above the murmuring, bundled crowd, stretching back to the crooked timber frames of the butcher's stall and the baker's window, stood the gallows. It was a rather plain gallows, all things considered, constructed of sturdy, unvarnished oak, its crossbeam perfectly level, its trapdoor freshly oiled and groaning faintly like an old man waking. A singular noose, thick and undeniably functional, swayed with an almost imperceptible rhythm in the indifferent breeze. A silent pendulum counting down minutes that were not its own. And beneath this stark wooden monument to finality stood Barnaby Buttons. Barnaby Buttons, Jester to King Thistlewick III, a monarch whose temper was as short as his stature, and whose appreciation for true wit was as profound as a puddle. Barnaby himself was not a man of grand stature either, nor of particular grace, but he possessed a certain lanky resilience, a kind of wiry endurance that had seen him through countless minor humiliations and the occasional legitimate beating. Today, however, promised a rather more significant and entirely permanent form of dismissal. His crime, if one could elevate such a thing to the status of crime, had been to suggest quite loudly, during a royal banquet, that the king's new coronation crown sat upon his majesty's head with all the precarious dignity of a pigeon perched on a particularly wobbly fence post, implying quite obviously to anyone with an ounce of sense that the king's head was perhaps not quite large enough for the weight of his own ambition, or indeed the weight of the crown itself. It was, Barnaby had argued in his brief perfunctory trial, a mere observation of physics, not an insult. The royal historian, however, had declared it an act of sedition by way of impertinent metaphor, a charge that carried with it an undeniable gravity, rather unlike Barnaby's last jest. He stood now, a figure of faded motley, his once vibrant yellows and blues dulled by countless washings and the rigors of a life spent tumbling and lampooning. His cap with its 3 floppy bells hung askew, one bell entirely missing, its threadbare remnant dangling forlornly. His face, usually contorted into exaggerated grimaces of mirth or mock terror, was for once rather still, a canvas of pale weariness punctuated by dark smudges beneath his eyes. Yet, despite the gravity of the situation, the crowd, thick and expectant, did not entirely pity him. They had come, not just for the spectacle of death, but for the last performance of Barnaby Buttons. Such was the morbid economy of public entertainment in Eldoria. Well then, Barnaby announced, his voice surprisingly clear, cutting through the low hum of the crowd like a dull knife through soft butter. He cleared his throat, a small, gravelly sound, and shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other. It seems the management has decided to cancel my long-running engagement. A shame, really. I thought my act was just starting to get its legs. Or perhaps he squinted up at the noose, a flicker of something close to amusement playing about his lips. Perhaps they merely wished to see me swing for it. A ripple of nervous laughter, quick and uncertain, spread through the front rows. This was Barnaby, after all. Even on the precipice he was expected to deliver. He looked at the executioner, a hulking man named Grimshaw, whose face was as impassive as a block of granite. Grimshaw held the coiled rope with a practiced grip, his knuckles white. "A word, Master Grimshaw, if you please," Barnaby continued, tilting his head. "Do you find, in your line of work, That the clientele are particularly stiff? Or do they perhaps loosen up a bit after the initial shock? Grimshaw grunted, a sound like stones grinding together, and did not reply. The priest, Father Alaric, who stood beside Barnaby clutching a rather water-stained holy book, sighed heavily, adjusting his spectacles on the bridge of his nose. "Barnaby, please," he murmured, his voice a soft rasp. "Consider your immortal soul?" Barnaby turned to the priest, a mock-serious expression settling on his face. "Ah, Father, my soul is as immortal as the king's promise to pay me on time, which is to say, subject to considerable delay, and likely to be found wanting in the end. Still, if you could put in a good word for me up there, tell them I was always good for a laugh, even if it was at my own expense. And tell them I always paid my tavern tab eventually." Another round of chuckles, this time a little bolder, a little more confident. The crowd was warming up. They knew this routine. Barnaby, the condemned, lampooning his own fate. It was a classic. He then addressed the crowd directly, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mock welcome, as if he were about to begin a particularly daring juggle. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted scoundrels," he boomed, his voice gaining a theatrical resonance. "It is a truly humbling experience, I must admit, to perform for such a discerning audience. Though I must confess the seating arrangements leave something to be desired. Those in the back might find their view somewhat obstructed, unless they fancy a fine view of my soon-to-be dangling feet." A few men in the back stood on tiptoes, trying to crane their necks. Barnaby spotted a familiar face near the front, a portly baker with flour dusting his apron. "Ah, Master Miller. Did you bring a fresh loaf? I do hope it's not as dense as the charges brought against me." Master Miller managed a weak, nervous smile, clutching his hands together. "Indeed," Barnaby mused, his gaze drifting over the sea of faces, some curious, some grim, some openly entertained. "One spends a lifetime honing one's craft, perfecting the pratfall, refining the insult, only to find that the ultimate punchline is delivered by a man who prefers a rope to a rhyme. A tragic irony, won't you agree?" He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Though few in the crowd were truly grappling with the philosophical implications of a jester's final jest, they were merely enjoying the show. This was entertainment after all, served raw and immediate. He then began to pantomime, pulling imaginary objects from his sleeves, pretending to juggle invisible balls, his movements slow and deliberate, a shadow play of past performances. "Behold," he declared, holding up an empty hand, "the king's generosity, as you can see, utterly boundless in its invisibility." He made a show of patting down his tattered tunic. "And here, my severance pay, paid in full, as you might observe, with ample room for improvement." He sighed dramatically, letting his hands fall to his sides. "It seems I have little left to give, save for this humble body and a few well-worn jests. Though I'm told my spirit will soon take flight, perhaps to join a circus of celestial clowns. One can only hope they appreciate a good jest there. Unlike some monarchs I could mention, but shan't, for obvious reasons." A small boy, perched precariously on his father's shoulders, giggled, pointing at Barnaby's floppy hat. Barnaby caught his eye and winked. "Yes, young man, even jesters must face the music eventually. Though this particular tune promises to be rather brief, I do hope it's not too jarring for your delicate ears." He pulled at one of his bells, the last remaining one, giving it a gentle, mournful shake. It produced a faint, lonely jingle. He looked at it for a moment, then shrugged. "A final flourish, then, for the loyal patrons of my comedic endeavors. You've been a wonderful audience. Far more appreciative than the last one, I must say, though that's hardly a high bar." He coughed again, a dry, rattling sound this time, and a flicker of genuine fatigue crossed his features. The effort of keeping up the pretense of being Barnaby Buttons to the very last was beginning to weigh upon him. The air was colder than it seemed, the wooden platform harder, the rope thicker. He took a slow, deliberate bow, a deep, sweeping motion that threatened to send him tumbling forward. When he straightened, his eyes held a distant, almost peaceful quality. "And so, dear friends," he said, his voice softer now, almost a murmur, "the grand finale approaches. No encores tonight, I'm afraid. The management is rather strict on that point. A one-night-only performance, with a rather permanent closing act." He looked from the crowd to Grimshaw, then to Father Alaric, and finally his gaze settled on a patch of sunlight that had just broken through the clouds, illuminating a small, insignificant dust mote dancing in the air near the gallows' upright post. For a fleeting moment his face seemed to relax entirely, the lines of weariness softening, the practiced mask of jocularity finally slipping away. It was a strangely mundane observation for such a pivotal moment, this small dance of dust in the sunbeam, but it held his attention. The crowd, sensing a shift, grew quieter, their expectant murmurs fading to a hushed anticipation. The entertainment, it seemed, was drawing to a close. The real business was about to begin. Barnaby took a deep, shuddering breath, a final unironic intake of the crisp autumn air. His performance indeed was over. Chapter 2. A King's Wrath. The cold bite of the gallows platform had jolted Barnaby back into a grim awareness, but his mind, ever a wanderer, had already begun its descent into the labyrinth of memory, specifically to the night that had set this final performance into motion. It was not so long ago, perhaps a scant 2 months, yet it felt like an age, a lifetime ago, a different world entirely. That night, the great hall of Castle Eldoria had been ablaze with 1,000 candles, their eager flames licking at the high, vaulted ceiling, casting dancing shadows upon the ancient tapestries that depicted triumphant, if largely fictional, battles fought by Thistlewick ancestors. The air had been thick with the mingled scents of roasted boar, spiced wine, and the cloying sweetness of sugared almonds, all punctuated by the heavy, metallic perfume of the king's new coronation crown. King Thistlewick III, a man whose physical stature was inversely proportionate to the immensity of his ego, had insisted on wearing the crown even at casual banquets since its recent forging. It was a rather ostentatious piece, crafted from unyielding gold, encrusted with so many sapphires and rubies that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a veritable small fortress of precious stone perched precariously upon a head that was, by generous estimation, merely average. It sat upon his brow with the unsettling instability of a small boat on a choppy sea, swaying gently with every pontifical nod, every self-important gesture. It was this visual, this perpetual, subtle teetering, that had planted the seed of Barnaby's ultimate undoing. Barnaby, true to his vocation, had been flitting about the hall, a kaleidoscope of motley amidst the duller finery of the courtiers, dispensing carefully calibrated jests. Some were gentle, aimed at the foibles of the lesser nobles. Others were pointed, subtly skewering the vanities of the higher ranks, always with an escape route of plausible deniability. He had juggled oranges that night, a surprisingly complex act involving 3 particularly ripe citrus fruits and a minor miracle of hand-eye coordination. He had even performed his famous talking parrot routine, wherein he would perch a stuffed bird upon his shoulder and engage in a witty, if entirely ventriloquistic, dialogue about the political machinations of the royal household, always ensuring the parrot was just vague enough to avoid direct accusation. The king, surprisingly, had been in a relatively benign mood, a rare occurrence. He had even managed a thin, reedy chuckle at Barnaby's expense, which in Thistlewick's court was akin to a standing ovation. Perhaps it was this unwanted royal geniality, or perhaps it was the 3rd goblet of exceptionally potent mead that Barnaby had unthinkingly consumed. but a dangerous bravado began to simmer beneath his usually cautious exterior. He had performed his entire repertoire, exhausted his safer material. The crowd, now slightly tipsy and comfortably entertained, looked to him for more. Even the king, from his throne, had given him an impatient little wave, a gesture that meant, "Amuse me, fool, or be gone." And it was at that precise moment, as Barnaby's gaze fell upon the king's wobbling crown, that the ill-fated inspiration struck. "Your Majesty," Barnaby had begun, his voice adopting a tone of mock solemnity, cutting through the low murmur of conversation that had resumed. The hall fell silent, all eyes turning to the jester. Barnaby had, perhaps for the first time, held the undivided attention of every single person in the hall, from the lowest scullery maid to the highest duke, and of course the king himself. "I have been observing with great fascination the majestic new coronation crown that so gloriously adorns your royal person." He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air, dripping with unctuous flattery. The king preened, a flicker of smug satisfaction crossing his features. "Indeed, Barnaby?" Thistlewick poured, a slight smile playing on his thin lips, anticipating a compliment of unparalleled extravagance. "Indeed, your Majesty," Barnaby continued, a mischievous glint entering his eyes, a glint he knew, even then, he should have suppressed. "One cannot help but marvel at its sheer presence. It sits upon your head, your Majesty." And here Barnaby had taken a step closer, adopting a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried to the furthest corners of the hall, with all the precarious dignity of a particularly plump pigeon, perched upon a fence post that has seen better days. One rather expects it to take flight at any moment, does one not? A beat of absolute, terrifying silence followed. The kind of silence that swallows all sound, all breath, leaving only the frantic beating of one's own heart. Then, a single sharp gasp from a lady-in-waiting, quickly stifled. The phrase, "a particularly plump pigeon," perched upon a fence post that has seen better days, was, of course, a thinly veiled and rather direct commentary on two things: the king's physical head, which was not particularly large, and by extension, his often questioned capacity for leadership, implying a lack of solid foundation. The fence post that has seen better days was not merely a physical observation. It was a metaphorical jab at the stability of the Thistlewick dynasty itself, or at least the wisdom of its current occupant. King Thistlewick's face, which had been basking in anticipated praise, transformed with a speed that startled even those accustomed to his mercurial temper. The smugness evaporated, replaced first by a flicker of confusion, then a flush of deep crimson, and finally a cold, terrible fury that seemed to drain all light from his eyes. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened where they gripped the arms of his throne, and a vein pulsed ominously in his temple. The crown, as if sensing the shift in mood, seemed to wobble with increased agitation. "A pigeon, Barnaby?" The king's voice was low, dangerously so, a mere whisper that nonetheless vibrated with lethal intent. A pigeon? Barnaby, whose mind was now desperately trying to backtrack, to find an escape clause, a way to reframe the jest as innocent observation, found his wit, for once entirely abandoned him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His usual quick retorts, his saving ironies, were swallowed by the sudden, oppressive weight of the king's wrath. He could only stand there, his motley suddenly feeling like a funeral shroud, his bells silent. "Sights o' him!" the king roared, leaping to his feet, a shocking burst of energy from his small frame. The crown, in that sudden movement, finally slipped, tumbling ignominiously from his head to land with a muffled clink on the velvet cushion beside his feet. This visual confirmation of Barnaby's just only served to further ignite Thistlewick's rage. "Sights o' this seditious fool! Guards, to the dungeon with him, and let him ponder the meaning of his insolence." Two burly royal guards, Men whose faces were as expressionless as the king's was furious, moved with practiced efficiency. They grabbed Barnaby roughly by the arms, their gauntlets digging into his flesh. He offered no resistance. The mirth had utterly drained from the whole, replaced by palpable tension, a collective holding of breath. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to speak. The silence was broken only by the clatter of Barnaby's worn boots on the marble floor as he was dragged away, and the faint, lonely jingle of one of his cap bells, dislodged by the rough handling, as it rolled under a banqueting table and came to rest near a discarded chicken bone. The trial, if one could dignify such a travesty with the term, had been brief, perfunctory, and entirely predetermined. It took place not in the formal court of justice, but in a small, musty chamber adjacent to the dungeon itself, presided over by King Thistlewick's most obsequious and least imaginative advisers. Barnaby was charged with sedition by way of impertinent metaphor, a novel offense surely, and one specifically tailored to his particular crime. The royal historian, a perpetually nervous man named Master Elms, had testified that the king's coronation crown was not merely a piece of jewelry, but a sacred symbol of Eldorian sovereignty, imbued with centuries of royal dignity. To compare its placement on the king's head to a pigeon on a wobbly fence post was, in Master Elm's quivering summation, to desecrate the very essence of the crown, and by extension the entire glorious lineage of Thistlewick monarchs. It was an attack on the stability of the realm, a verbal equivalent of treason. Barnaby had been given the opportunity to speak in his defense. "Your Graces," he had begun, his voice surprisingly calm despite the stench of damp stone and the cloying fear in the air. "I merely observed a truth of physics. Heavy object, small base, inherent instability." It was a jest, a simple observation, not an act of sedition. He had even tried to offer another jest, a desperate final attempt to use his only weapon. Perhaps His Majesty's ambition outstrips the natural dimensions of his cranium, a common affliction among monarchs, I hear. No insult intended, merely a medical insight, perhaps. This had only further enraged the king, who had been listening from behind a thin tapestry, his shadow visible through the fabric. Medical insight? Thistlewick had shrieked, his voice muffled by the cloth. It is a public mockery, a direct affront. He suggests my head is small. Small? He suggests my reign is unstable. Unstable? This is not jest, this is venom. And so, with little deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. The sentence, execution by hanging, to be carried out publicly, as a warning against the dangers of uncontrolled jocularity and metaphorical insolence. Barnaby, listening to the pronouncement, had felt a peculiar sense of detachment. It was absurd, of course, to be condemned for a joke, a rather dull joke. If he were truly honest with himself, certainly not his finest work. But then, Thistlewick's reign was nothing if not absurd. He had merely held up a mirror, and the king, seeing his own reflected silliness, had reacted with the full, disproportionate force of his fragile power. In the silence of his dungeon cell, as the days crawled by, marked only by the drip of moisture from the ceiling and the occasional skittering of unseen creatures, Barnaby had ample time to reflect. He had considered the irony of it all. His life had been dedicated to making light of seriousness, to puncturing pomposity with wit. Now, his own life was to be ended by the sheer, unyielding seriousness of a man who could not bear to be seen as anything less than perfectly formidable. He had been a jester, a fool by profession, but in the end it was the king who proved the greatest fool, unable to tolerate even the most fleeting glimpse of his own fragile humanity. Barnaby had chuckled then, a dry, humorless sound in the echoing darkness. It was a morbid punchline, certainly, but a punchline nonetheless. And now, the final act of this particularly dark comedy was upon him, the stage set, the audience assembled, the noose patiently swaying. He had delivered his final performance on the gallows, a deliberate echo of that ill-fated banquet, and soon the king would have his grim satisfaction. Chapter 3. The absurdity of the sentence. The noose hung still now, its subtle sway arrested by the absolute stillness of the air, a stillness born from the collective-held breath of the crowd and the somber reality of the impending finality. Barnaby, standing on the rough-hewn planks of the gallows, felt the peculiar chill of the autumn morning seep into his bones, a cold that was not entirely from the weather, but from the knowledge that this entire elaborate tableau was being enacted for a joke. A joke. The sheer, unvarnished absurdity of it was a current beneath the surface of his weary thoughts, a persistent, low hum that threatened to break through the solemnity with an unexpected, hysterical laugh. He was to die, not for treason, nor for theft, nor for murder, but for the mere suggestion that a crown sat precariously upon a head, and that said head might not be quite large enough to bear the weight of such an elaborate trinket. King Thistlewick III, as Barnaby knew all too well, was a man consumed by an almost pathological need for validation. His diminutive stature, a fact he was keenly aware of despite his constant efforts to appear taller through cunningly designed shoes, and exaggeratedly high thrones, fueled an insatiable hunger for deference and flattery. Every word uttered in his presence, every bow, every glance was meticulously scrutinized for the slightest hint of disrespect. His coronation crown, the very object of Barnaby's fatal observation, was not merely a symbol of his office, it was a physical manifestation of his desperate yearning for grandeur. It was big, it was heavy, it was ostentatious, and it quite demonstrably did not sit comfortably on his head. To point out this undeniable truth, even in jest, was to rip a tear in the fragile fabric of his carefully constructed royal persona. It was, in his mind, not merely an insult, but an act of decoronation, a metaphorical dethroning performed by a common fool. The court, a collection of powdered wigs and self-serving smiles, was a testament to the king's inflated ego. Each noble, each adviser, each whispered word was calibrated to soothe the king's anxieties and reinforce his delusions of omnipotence. To contradict Thistlewick was not merely impolitic. It was an act of social, if not literal, suicide. They were all complicit, bound by fear and ambition to uphold the increasingly fragile facade of his absolute wisdom and unquestionable authority. Barnaby, in his role as Jester, had been granted a unique, precarious license to speak truths that no one else dared utter, to cloak criticisms in humor, to be the mirror that sometimes reflected unpleasant realities. But even a jester's license had its limits, especially when the reflection was too stark, too undeniable, too close to the king's deepest insecurities. The charge itself, sedition by way of impertinent metaphor, was a masterpiece of legalistic gymnastics, a phrase so ponderous and self-important that it perfectly encapsulated the absurdity of the entire situation. It had been concocted by the royal scribes and refined by Master Elms, the royal historian, a man whose spine was as flexible as his logic was contorted. Master Elms, with his perpetually damp brow and trembling hands, had delivered his testimony at Barnaby's mock trial with a theatrical gravitas that would have been comical under different circumstances. He had argued with an almost frantic intensity that the king's crown was not just a symbol of power, but the very crucible of Eldorian identity, forged in the fires of ancient tradition and imbued with the collective dignity of every Thistlewick monarch stretching back to the mythical Thistlewick I, who, according to legend, had pulled the first turnip from the soil and declared it kingdom. To suggest that such a sacred artifact, perched upon the head of the current, divinely appointed ruler, was akin to a pigeon on a wobbly fence post was not merely disrespectful. Master Elms had intoned, his voice rising to a reedy crescendo. It was an attack upon the very foundations of the realm. It was an insinuation that the king was weak, that his rule was unstable, that his lineage was, well, that his lineage was as prone to teetering as a small bird on an old piece of wood. The sheer intellectual dishonesty, the deliberate misinterpretation of a light-hearted observation was breathtaking. Barnaby had listened, leaning against the cold stone of his dungeon cell, a bitter amusement stirring within him. He had spent years crafting nuanced jests, subtle barbs, and now he was to be executed for a rather blunt, if accurate, visual gag. It was almost insulting to his professional integrity. The court, far from questioning this elaborate fabrication, had nodded gravely. Each courtier, from the pompous Duke of Flax to the endlessly simpering Countess of Petal, had echoed the king's indignation, vying for his approval by condemning Barnaby with increasingly florid denunciations. They spoke of the sanctity of the crown, the divine right of kings, the absolute necessity of crushing any whisper of dissent, no matter how humorously delivered. Their faces, usually carefully schooled into expressions of polite indifference, were now animated by a performative outrage, a desperate pantomime of loyalty. They knew, as Barnaby knew, that the king was overreacting. They knew that a jester's role was to poke and prod, to speak the unspeakable, to be the truth-teller cloaked in bells and motley. But their own skins were too precious, their own positions too precarious, to risk even a flicker of dissent. And so, the farce played out, with Barnaby as its unwitting, soon-to-be-extinguished protagonist. Even the public execution, now unfolding before Barnaby's weary eyes, was part of this grand, absurd spectacle. It was meant to be a warning, a chilling reminder that even laughter, if directed at the wrong target, could lead to the gravest consequences. Yet, the crowd gathered below, though hushed and expectant, was not truly horrified. They were merely entertained. They had paid their coins for a view of the gallows, for the last performance of Barnaby Buttons. The king sought to instill fear, but he had merely provided another macabre act for the masses. The common folk, long accustomed to the capricious whims of their rulers, saw not a solemn act of justice, but a particularly grim puppet show, with Barnaby as the unfortunate marionette. They whispered about the joke, about the king's temper, about the precise wobble of the crown. They understood the humor, even if their lives depended on not voicing it too loudly. Barnaby, as he had delivered his final gallows performance, had felt a quiet, almost serene detachment from the unfolding tragedy. His life, so filled with the pursuit of laughter, was ending in a moment of profound, humorless seriousness, orchestrated by the very man who most desperately needed to lighten his own spirit. The king, in his blind rage, was executing not just a man, but the very function of a jester, the ability to find truth in absurdity, to make light of power. He was, in effect, executing the last vestige of self-awareness in his own court. In his cell, in the days leading up to this morning, Barnaby had spent hours contemplating this irony. He had come to see King Thistlewick not as a fearsome tyrant, but as a particularly pathetic figure, a man so utterly devoid of inner security that a simple observation could shatter his composure and incite such disproportionate fury. He was a king who wore his insecurities like a crown, heavy and ill-fitting, constantly threatening to topple. Barnaby, the fool, was perhaps the only one who had truly seen him, truly understood the fragile man beneath the gilded robes. And for that insight, for merely holding up a mirror to the king's own reflection, he was to die. The thought, far from filling him with despair, had occasionally brought a wry smile to his lips. What a tale it would make! A jester, condemned by a king for a joke about his head and his crown. It was the stuff of ballads, tragic and comical in equal measure, a testament to the enduring foolishness of power unchecked by humor. His life had been a series of jests, and his death, it seemed, would be the grandest, most absurd jest of all. He was, in essence, being punished for performing his job too well, for hitting too close to the unacknowledged truth. As the executioner, Grimshaw, finally stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding softly on the platform, Barnaby looked out at the faces in the crowd. There was the baker, Master Miller, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sorrow. There was the small boy on his father's shoulders, still looking a little confused but utterly captivated. And in their eyes, Barnaby saw not just the morbid curiosity, but a flicker of understanding, a shared acknowledgment of the sheer, unmitigated ridiculousness of the entire situation. He was not dying for a crime against the kingdom. He was dying for a crime against the king's ego. And that, Barnaby thought with a final internal sigh, was the most tragic punchline of all. It was a joke, now irrevocably turned upon himself, and the only audience left to appreciate the full dark irony was Barnaby Buttons himself. The final act, unwritten until this very moment, was about to play out. Chapter 4. The Night Before the Gallows. The damp chill of the dungeon stone had long since permeated Barnaby's threadbare motley, settling deep into his bones like a persistent cough. Sleep, that elusive, mocking mistress, had refused to grant him even a fleeting moment of oblivion. The night stretched before him, an endless inky canvas upon which his mind painted scenes, both familiar and frightening, all underscored by the relentless, monotonous drip of water from a crack in the ceiling, each drop a tiny liquid clock counting down the final hours. He lay upon a thin, vermin-ridden pallet, his arms folded beneath his head, staring at the unseen ceiling. The darkness was absolute, save for a faint phosphorescent glow from a patch of moss near the far corner, a pale, sickly light that seemed only to deepen the shadows around it. It was a night for introspection, Barnaby mused, though he would have preferred a good, honest snore. A night to reflect on a life spent in pursuit of laughter, often at his own expense, and now, ultimately, at the expense of his very existence. What a peculiar trajectory, he thought, to be born into a world of endless seriousness, only to dedicate oneself to puncturing it with bladder sticks and carefully aimed quips. And what an even more peculiar end, to be extinguished not by a righteous sword or a peasant's pitchfork, but by the fragile ego of a man who could not bear to be told, even jokingly, that his head was, to put it mildly, dimensionally challenged for the crown he so desperately craved. The irony of it all was a sharp, bitter taste in his mouth, more potent than any dungeon gruel. He had seen men hanged for true transgressions, theft of a king's deer, treasonous whispers, even the occasional spectacular murder. These were crimes that made a certain amount of sense, crimes with tangible victims and comprehensible motivations. But sedition by way of impertinent metaphor, it sounded like a charge dreamt up by a particularly humorless scholar on too much stale bread and weak ale. Yet here he was, Barnaby Buttons, professional purveyor of silliness, awaiting the dawn that would lead him to the gallows, all because he had observed a certain physical truth about a crown and a head. Perhaps he should have stuck to juggling oranges. They, at least, never took offense. His life as a jester had been a tightrope walk over an abyss of royal displeasure. He remembered the time he had suggested that the king's new hunting hounds possessed a keener nose for royal compliments than for rabbits, resulting in a week of solitary confinement with only the rats for company. Or the incident where he had mimicked the queen's penchant for elaborate wigs, inadvertently knocking one from a lady-in-waiting's head, leading to a public whipping that still made his back ache on damp mornings. But those were mere pinpricks, minor slaps on the wrist compared to this grand finale. This was the ultimate, unrepeatable jest, where the punchline was his own neck. He shifted on the straw, trying to find a comfortable position, a futile endeavor. Every bone in his body seemed to ache, a symphony of minor complaints joining the drip, drip, drip from above. The thought of King Thistlewick, tucked away in his silken bed, presumably dreaming of further acts of self-aggrandizement, stirred a fresh wave of weary amusement. Tislowick was a king who wore his insecurities like a fur cloak, heavy and suffocating. He saw threats in every shadow, insults in every jest, and slights in every flicker of independent thought. Barnaby had often wondered if the king truly believed his own propaganda, if he truly saw himself as the mighty, unassailable monarch depicted in the court paintings, or if, in the lonely quiet of his chambers, he too sometimes felt the crown slip, the facade crack. Perhaps, Barnaby mused, his own death would serve as a final, albeit unintended, jest upon the king. Make us a shrine. What message would it send to future jesters? That truth, when spoken plainly, was more dangerous than a drawn sword. That laughter, when it grazed too close to the ego of power, was the most treasonous act of all. It was a bleak lesson, certainly. But then Eldoria was a bleak kingdom, ruled by a man who valued appearance over substance and flattery over truth. He, Barnaby, had been the designated fool, the one allowed to point out the emperor's lack of clothes. Now, it seemed, the emperor had decided to dispose of the mirror entirely. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure the image of a soft, sun-dappled meadow, a place far removed from damp cells and impending nooses. But his mind kept returning to the gallows, to the rough feel of the wood, the subtle sway of the rope. He imagined the faces in the crowd, the morbid curiosity, the whispered comments. Would they remember the jokes? Or would they only remember the swift, final drop? It was a strange legacy to be remembered as the jester who died for a joke about a king's head. Not quite the grand epic he might have envisioned for himself, but then, life rarely followed the dramatic arc one intended. Often it merely tripped over a misplaced jest. A rat scurried across the floor near his feet, a faint scratching sound in the oppressive silence. Barnaby merely listened, his senses heightened by the sleeplessness. He wondered what the rat thought of his predicament. Probably nothing. Rats had more practical concerns, like finding scraps of discarded food and avoiding traps. They understood the simple, brutal realities of survival. No grand metaphors for them, no concerns about fragile egos. Just the cold, hard facts of existence. He almost envied the rat its uncomplicated perspective. The hours dragged on, each minute a tiny eternity. He thought of the taste of spiced wine, the warmth of a tavern fire, the rare genuine laugh shared with a few trusted friends, not the forced, nervous titters of the court. He remembered the thrill of landing a particularly clever pun, the fleeting sense of connection with an audience, even for a moment. All those small, fleeting joys, now mere memories in the echoing darkness. He had never been a man of grand ambitions, merely a man who sought to make others smile, or at least grimace in amused discomfort. And for that he was to be rewarded with a swift journey into the unknown. He wondered about death. Was it a dark void? A new, perhaps more appreciative, audience? Would there be a cosmic jester to greet him, ready to trade barbs about the absurdity of existence? Or would it simply be nothing? The thought of nothingness was strangely soothing. No more jokes, no more kings, no more wobbly crowns. Just quiet. An eternal quiet. Something he had rarely known in a life filled with bells and laughter and the constant din of a bustling court. Perhaps that was the ultimate mercy, the final, perfect punchline. To be silenced by the very man who could not tolerate silence. He listened to the distant hoot of an owl, a mournful sound that seemed to echo his own resigned weariness. The air grew perceptibly colder, signaling the approach of dawn. Soon, the first faint gray light would filter through the small, barred window high above, turning the oppressive blackness into a dull, undeniable gloom. Soon, the guards would come. Soon the performance would resume, culminating in its final silent act. Barnaby closed his eyes again. not in an attempt to sleep, but simply to embrace the darkness for a few more moments before the world and King Thistlewick demanded his final unwilling attention. He was tired, so terribly tired. Perhaps, just perhaps, this whole ordeal would at least offer him the opportunity for a really, really long nap. A final dark chuckle rumbled in his chest, a sound unheard by anyone but himself, a private jest for the last moments of his long, ridiculous night. Chapter 5. The crowd gathers the first insidious tendrils of dawn, thin and pale as a forgotten ghost, began to seep through the dungeon's high barred window, dispelling the absolute blackness of Barnaby's long night with a dull, undeniable gray. It was not a comforting light, merely a revealing one, illuminating the damp patches on the stone walls, the scuttling of a particularly bold spider, and the weary drawn lines on Barnaby's face. He had not slept. Sleep, it seemed, was a luxury reserved for those without a hanging appointment. A scuffling sound, distant at first, then growing closer, finally broke the echoing silence of the prison corridor. The heavy clang of keys, the rasp of a bolt, and then the creak of his cell door, a sound more final than any pronouncement. Two guards, faceless hulks, silhouetted against the slightly less oppressive gloom of the corridor, stood there. Their eyes were as devoid of expression as their helmets. One carried a lantern, its flickering flame casting dancing, elongated shadows that made the cramped cell seem even more cavernous. "Time, Jester," one of them grunted, his voice a low rumble. It was not unkind, merely perfunctory. The sound of a man simply doing his job. Barnaby pushed himself up from the straw pallet, his joints protesting with a symphony of aches. He smoothed down his motley, a futile gesture of dignity. The bells on his cap, still as mournful as ever, did not jingle. He stood, a little wobbly, and followed them out. The stone corridor was colder than his cell, the air thick with the smell of old damp and the faint, unsettling scent of iron. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing, a slow, deliberate march towards the inevitable. He heard the distant sounds of the castle beginning to stir, the clatter of pots, the low murmur of servants. Life, it seemed, went on, even when one's own was about to abruptly cease. Outside the castle gates, the town of Eldoria was already stirring, a peculiar hum rising from the cobbled streets. It was earlier than most would typically be out, yet a surprising number of figures were already converging towards the market square. A dark, bundled tide flowing towards the stark silhouette of the Gallows. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of a sharp, clear day, but also the scent of anticipation, thick and almost palpable. Small groups huddled together, their breath misting in the cold, their voices a low, conspiratorial buzz. This was not a crowd roused by alarm or distress. It was a crowd drawn by spectacle, by the irresistible pull of a public event, particularly one involving a jester. The baker, Master Miller, was among the earliest arrivals, having finished his morning bake. He stood near the front of the burgeoning crowd, his flour-dusted apron a stark contrast to his nervous, twitching hands. He shifted from foot to foot, his gaze fixed on the gallows, an internal debate surely raging between the morbid curiosity that drew him here and the genuine, if fleeting, sorrow he felt for Barnaby. He had enjoyed Barnaby's jests over the years, found them a rare burst of sharp light in the monotonous routine of dough and ovens. Now that light was to be extinguished. From the narrow lanes and crooked alleys, more people emerged. Farmers in coarse woolens, their faces ruddy from the cold and early toil. Washerwomen, their hands still raw from the icy river, clutching shawls tightly around them. Apprentices and servants, given a rare reprieve from their duties to witness the event. Even a scattering of townsfolk of slightly higher standing, their finer cloaks drawn tight, their expressions a studied blend of solemnity and avid interest. Children, eyes wide and unblinking, were hoisted onto father's shoulders, eager for a better view of the macabre show. They didn't fully grasp the finality of it, merely the excitement of a day out, a break from chores, and the promise of a story to tell. The square itself was transforming. What was usually a bustling marketplace, alive with the cries of vendors and the haggling of merchants, was today a solemn amphitheater, its usual commerce suspended for a grimmer exchange. Hawkers, ever opportunistic, moved among the early arrivals, though their wares were limited. A vendor selling small, greasy meat pies called out his offerings, his voice a little subdued. Another peddled small flasks of weak, warming ale, his cries a little more urgent. The scent of wood smoke mingled with damp earth, and the collective human aroma of unwashed bodies, stale breath, and cheap perfume. Did you hear the joke he made then? A burly blacksmith whispered to his neighbor, leaning in conspiratorially. About the king's head and the crown? Said it looked like a pigeon on a shaky fence post, he did. A low chuckle, quickly stifled, passed between them. They had all heard it, of course. It had spread like wildfire through the taverns and workshops, a delicious piece of forbidden humor. It was dangerous to repeat too loudly, but here, in the anonymity of the crowd, a quiet recounting of Barnaby's wit was almost a tribute. A bold man. That Barnaby, the neighbor replied, shaking his head. Too bold, perhaps. The king's temper, you know. Like a summer storm, swift and terrible. Aye, the blacksmith agreed, his eyes flicking to the gallows. But a joke, mind you, not a rebellion. Is it truly worth a man's life? He didn't expect an answer. Such questions were for quiet nights by the fire, not for public pronouncements. The crowd, for all its solemnity, was also an unspoken jury, passing judgment not on Barnaby, but on the disproportionate wrath of their king. The processional began, a slow, deliberate march from the castle gates. Barnaby, flanked by the same two silent guards, was led by Father Alaric, his prayer book clutched tightly, and followed by the hulking figure of Grimshaw, the executioner, who carried the coiled rope with a practiced, almost tender care. A hush fell over the crowd as they merged, a ripple of quiet spreading outwards like rings on a pond. Every neck craned, every eye fixed on the motley figure in the center of the procession. Barnaby's cap, with its solitary bell, seemed to droop mournfully. As they moved through the growing throng, Barnaby, ever the performer, instinctively assessed his audience. He saw the baker, Master Miller, his face a mask of sorrow. He saw the small boy, still perched on his father's shoulders, pointing a curious finger. He saw the nervous smiles, the solemn nods, the outright grimaces of morbid fascination. It was a good crowd, certainly, larger than some of his more poorly advertised shows. A shame he couldn't take a bow at the end. Or perhaps, he thought, a truly deep bow from the neck would be his final, unforgettable flourish. The murmuring in the crowd intensified as the procession drew closer to the gallows. It was a low, guttural hum, a blend of anticipation, whispered commentary, and the rustling of garments. People adjusted their positions, elbowing gently for a better vantage point. The occasional cough broke the sound, or the cry of a restless child quickly hushed by a parent. The collective breath of the square seemed to hold, suspended in the chill morning air. The gallows, stark and imposing, stood as the undeniable focal point, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky. Its unvarnished wood seemed to absorb the light, drawing all eyes to its grim purpose. Barnaby's gaze swept over the sea of faces. A lifetime of observations compressed into these final moments. He had spent his life reading audiences, sensing their mood, their desires, their vulnerabilities. And here, in their faces, he saw the enduring human fascination with the edge, with the moment where life tipped over into oblivion. They were there not out of malice, but out of a simple, undeniable curiosity. A primal urge to witness the ultimate spectacle. And he Barnaby Buttons was to be their final, most unforgettable act. It was, in its own way, a jester's triumph to command such a stage, even if the price was rather steep. The sun had now fully cleared the horizon, casting long, stark shadows across the square. The cold remained, but the light brought with it a crisp clarity, making every detail of the gallows, every thread of Barnaby's worn motley, painfully distinct. The air vibrated with unspoken energy, a collective intake of breath, a silent count towards the moment the entertainment would truly begin. The crowd was ready. They had waited, they had gossiped, they had speculated. Now they were poised, expectant, for the final, tragic performance of the jester who had dared to speak a truth too close to a king's fragile heart. The executioner, Grimshaw, stepped onto the platform, his heavy boots sounding a solemn cadence, and the last of the murmurs died. All eyes were on Barnaby. Chapter 6. The Jester's Last Joke. The world, for Barnaby Buttons, had narrowed to the rough-hewn planks beneath his worn boots. The thick, unyielding rope dangling before his eyes, and the vast, expectant sea of faces that stretched back from the gallows platform. The collective hum of the crowd had died entirely, replaced by a profound, almost oppressive silence, broken only by the faint, distant caw of a crow and the gentle sigh of the wind through the eaves of the nearest buildings. Every eye was fixed on him, on Barnaby, the condemned jester, the man who had dared to speak a simple, inconvenient truth about a king's crown and a king's head. Grimshaw, the executioner, stood a heavy, silent presence beside him, his massive hands, calloused and scarred, holding the very instrument of Barnaby's demise. Father Alaric, clutching his holy book as if it were a life raft in a storm of sin, murmured prayers under his breath, his eyes flicking from Barnaby to the heavens with an expression of profound, spiritual despair. Barnaby felt a peculiar lightness, an almost ethereal detachment. The long, sleepless night, the cold dread, the weary march from the dungeon, all of it seemed to have culminated in this singular, suspended moment, a perfect pause before the plummet. His motley, once so vibrant, felt heavy and dull, a costume for a play that had gone on far too long. He looked out at the faces again. The baker, Master Miller, his eyes glistening with what might have been genuine sorrow, the small boy on his father's shoulders, his young face a mask of wide-eyed, uncomprehending fascination. The grim-faced soldiers, their expressions as stolid and unyielding as the castle walls. They had come for a spectacle, for the morbid thrill of witnessing a life extinguished. And Barnaby, the professional entertainer, knew, deep in his jester's soul, that he owed them one last performance. A final, unforgettable flourish, a parting jest to underscore the profound absurdity of his situation. His mind, despite the gravity of the moment, was surprisingly clear, almost unnervingly so. It was as if the impending finality had sharpened his wit, honed his satirical edge to an almost unbearable degree. He thought of King Thistlewick, undoubtedly already receiving reports of the gathering crowd, basking in the grim satisfaction of his power. He thought of the crown, the ostentatious, ill-fitting symbol that had brought him to this very precipice. The irony of it all, the sheer, unmitigated ridiculousness of dying for a joke, threatened to bubble up in a burst of hysterical laughter. But that wouldn't do. The last jest had to be precise, piercing, a final barb lodged firmly in the collective consciousness of Eldoria. It had to be a joke that would linger, a question mark etched into the air long after his last breath. He took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing himself up to his full, somewhat meager height. He adjusted his floppy, one-belled cap, a motion so ingrained it was automatic, a jester's unconscious tick. The single bell gave a faint, forlorn jingle, a sound like a distant, dying echo of all his past performances. He felt Grimshaw's impatient gaze on him, a silent pressure to expedite the proceedings. Father Alaric, sensing his movement, redoubled his whispered prayers, his hand reaching out, almost imperceptibly, as if to offer a final desperate benediction. Ladies, gentlemen, and fellow inhabitants of this remarkably peculiar kingdom. Barnaby's voice rang out, surprisingly strong, cutting through the heavy silence like a shard of ice. It held its usual theatricality, a slight exaggeration designed to capture attention. But beneath it was a tremor of something deeper, a quiet defiance that crackled in the crisp morning air. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd, allowing them to fully absorb his presence, to register that this was not merely the condemned, but Barnaby Buttons, preparing his final act. "I must confess," he continued, a wry smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "for all my years of performing, of tumbling and jesting and lampooning the great and the small, I never quite anticipated such a captive audience." He gestured vaguely at the assembled throng, then at the ropes binding his wrists, a subtle, self-deprecating guessed about his current predicament. A ripple, not of laughter, but of nervous recognition, passed through the front rows. They understood his meaning, and the inherent darkness of it. "Indeed," he mused, tilting his head slightly, as if pondering a particularly intricate riddle. "It seems that even in death, a jester is expected to provide entertainment. A rather grim encore, wouldn't you agree?" He looked at Father Alaric, then at Grimshaw, then back at the crowd, his gaze settling on Master Miller, who simply swallowed hard, unable to meet his eye. "I have spent a lifetime," Barnaby continued, his voice softer now, almost conversational, "trying to make heads lighter." He paused, his gaze deliberately sweeping over the crowd, lingering for a fraction of a second on the space where the king, if he were foolish enough to attend, would have stood, and then, very pointedly, on the general direction of the castle itself. "Now, it seems, my ultimate purpose is to make one particular head, and eat all heads that might be inclined to overthink such matters considerably heavier." A strange, uncomfortable silence descended. It was a silence filled with comprehension, with the sudden, sharp understanding of his meaning. He was referring, of course, to the weight of the crown on the king's head, and the weight of fear and absolute authority the king now sought to impose upon his subjects. He was referring to the gravity of his own death, which was meant to weigh heavily on their minds, making their own heads metaphorically heavy with caution and obedience. It was a double entendre, a subtle jab, delivered with the casual air of a man, merely commenting on the weather. But the implication, the biting truth beneath the surface, was unmistakable. He was saying, in his last breath, that the king's folly would only make their lives more burdensome, their thoughts more fearful. The reaction was not a burst of laughter, nor a collective gasp of horror. It was something far more unsettling. A few nervous coughs broke the silence. A woman in the front row pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. A man beside her, a stout merchant, let out a single strangled chuckle that quickly dissolved into a grimace. The small boy on his father's shoulders looked confused, his innocent gaze darting between Barnaby and his father's suddenly solemn face. The crowd was caught in an agonizing limbo, unsure how to react. Was it a joke? It certainly sounded like one, delivered with Barnaby's signature dry wit. But the context, the gallows, the noose, the absolute finality of it, turned the humor into something sharp and painful. It was a joke that dared them to laugh, knowing that to do so would be to acknowledge the king's inherent absurdity, and perhaps risk their own necks. Father Alaric let out a small, choked sound, a mixture of despair and exasperation, and squeezed his eyes shut. He muttered something about the impenitent soul, his fingers tightening on his prayer book until his knuckles were white. Grimshaw, the executioner, remained impassive, his gaze fixed on some point beyond Barnaby's head. But a slight, almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw was the only sign that the jester's final quip had registered. Even a man accustomed to the solemnity of death could not entirely ignore the sting of such audacious wit. Barnaby saw it all. The uncertainty in their eyes, the nervous shifting of their feet, the quiet, almost internal debate on whether to risk a smile or maintain a respectful, fearful silence. And in that moment, a profound satisfaction, cold and clear as mountain spring water, settled over him. He had done it. He had landed the final blow, not with a jest that would merely elicit a chuckle, but with one that would fester, that would plant a seed of unease and quiet rebellion in their hearts. They would remember this joke, not for its mirth, but for its truth. It was a joke that would haunt King Thistlewick's kingdom long after the jester himself had ceased to breathe. It was a joke that reminded them, even in their fear, that the king was a fool, and that his power, for all its might, was as precariously balanced as a crown on a head too small to bear its burden. He allowed the silence to stretch, to fully engulf the square, letting the weight of his words sink in. He had offered them not just a moment of amusement, but final bitter truth, a legacy forged in irony. His face, no longer tired, held a quiet, almost triumphant calm. The jester's work, in the grand, absurd scheme of things, was done. He had spoken his last, most dangerous truth. Now all that remained was the quiet. He looked at Grimshaw, a silent nod passing between them, a grim acknowledgment that the time for jesting was truly over. The executioner stepped forward, his heavy hand reaching for Barnaby's shoulder. The final, silent act was about to begin. Chapter 7. The noose tightens. The silence that had fallen over Eldorius Market Square was not merely the absence of sound. It was a living, breathing entity, heavy and suffocating, pressing down upon every bundled shoulder, every craned neck. It held the air itself, pausing the flutter of a stray leaf, the distant caw of a crow, the very beat of 1,000 hearts. All eyes were locked on Barnaby Buttons, standing upon the gallows platform, his motley a faded splash of color against the grim, unvarnished oak. His final biting quip had landed, not with a bang, but with a quiet, lingering sting, leaving the crowd in a state of uneasy contemplation, a collective internal shrug of uncomfortable understanding. Now the space for words had vanished. The time for the true, inevitable business had arrived. Grimshaw, the executioner, moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a man entirely comfortable with his grim craft. He was not a brute, not truly, though his physical presence was undeniable, a hulking monument to the finality he wielded. He stepped closer to Barnaby, his heavy boots making no sound on the thick planks. His hands, gnarled and calloused from years of working with rope and wood, moved with an almost surgical precision. He reached for the coiled rope, the instrument that had, for generations, drawn the final curtain on lives in Eldoria. It was a thick hempen rope, smelling faintly of tar and the damp air of storage, its fibers stiff and unforgiving. He uncoiled it with a smooth, practiced motion, the loops falling open with a soft, swishing sound that was shockingly loud in the profound silence. Barnaby watched him, his gaze distant, unfocused, as if observing a particularly intricate yet utterly uninteresting piece of clockwork. He had, at this moment, consciously decided to feign indifference, to wear the mask of amused detachment that had served him so well throughout his life as a jester. It was the only armor he possessed, the only way to meet the cold, hard face of oblivion without flinching. His lips, thin and pale, curved into the faintest of smiles, a private, knowing expression that no one in the crowd, save perhaps Father Alaric, could fully interpret. But Father Alaric, his face a landscape of spiritual agony, was too consumed by his own prayers to notice. Grimshaw began to work the noose, shaping the loop, checking the knot with meticulous care. This was not a hurried, frantic affair. This was a ritual, steeped in tradition and the grim necessity of state. He tested the fall of the rope, adjusted its length by mere inches, ensuring that the drop would be swift and clean, as merciful as such an act could be. The thick knot, known as the hangman's knot, was intricate, a series of precise turns and loops designed for maximum efficiency. Each twist of the rope, each tightening of a coil seemed to draw the air out of the square, making the already heavy silence even more absolute. The faint creak of the rope, almost imperceptible, was amplified by the collective holding of breath. And then Barnaby began to hum. It was a low, almost tuneless sound at first, a soft, reedy vibration in his throat. But gradually, it coalesced into a recognizable melody, a simple, repetitive children's rhyme, one often sung by mothers to lull fretful infants to sleep. It was a tune about a small, brownfield mouse seeking a warm bed for the winter, a comforting, innocuous ditty. The sound, so utterly incongruous with the grim reality of the gallows, was startling. It was soft, barely audible beyond the immediate vicinity of the platform. Yet, in the intense silence, it carried a small, defiant ripple in the oppressive calm. Grimshaw paused, his hands hovering over the rope, a flicker of something, perhaps confusion, perhaps a momentary irritation, crossing his impassive face. He glanced at Barnaby, his brow furrowed almost imperceptibly, as if trying to discern the meaning of this unexpected auditory rebellion. The jester's eyes, however, were still unfocused, distant, his gaze seemingly fixed on a point far beyond the heads of the crowd, somewhere in the pale autumn sky. He continued to hum, the simple tune unwavering, a steady rhythmic pulse in the face of death. It was a tune of innocence, of comfort, a deliberate counterpoint to the harshness of the moment. The crowd, sensing the shift, stirred. A few heads tilted, trying to catch the faint sound. Those closest to the gallows heard it clearly, the lullaby for a mouse, being hummed by a man about to die. A murmur, hushed and puzzled, began to spread through the front rows. Was this a final jest? A sign of madness? Or something else entirely? Something utterly unexpected from a man condemned to die. The irony of it was not lost on a few. A song about sleep, sung at the very precipice of eternal sleep. It was a dark, private joke, played out on the public stage. Barnaby's humming filled the small, immediate space around him, enveloping him in a strange, personal soundscape. It was as if he were constructing a tiny auditory barrier between himself and the brutal reality of his impending end. The tune was simple, almost monotonous, devoid of any dramatic flourishes. Just the steady, repetitive notes of a lullaby. It was a tune that had no place on the gallows, and precisely because of that, it was perfect. It underscored the profound absurdity of the entire situation. A man dying for a joke, humming a child's song. It was the ultimate act of Jester's defiance, to refuse to grant the moment the solemnity it demanded, to instead inject it with a quiet, almost domestic incongruity. Grimshaw, after his brief hesitation, resumed his work, his movements perhaps a fraction more abrupt than before. He swung the noose, a quick, almost angry flick of his wrist over Barnaby's head. The coarse hemp brushed against the jester's cheek, a rough, cold caress. Barnaby did not flinch. He merely continued to hum, the tune slightly muffled now by the proximity of the rope. It was placed around his neck, positioned precisely, the heavy knot resting just beneath his left ear. Grimshaw tightened it, not painfully, but firmly, adjusting the loop until it sat snug against the thin fabric of Barnaby's tunic. The scent of hemp, raw and earthy, filled Barnaby's nostrils, mingling with the faint, stale odor of his own clothes. Through it all, the humming continued. A steady, soft drone. Barnaby's eyes remained distant, fixed on that invisible point in the sky. He could feel the pressure of the rope, a cold, unyielding embrace. He could feel Grimshaw's fingers briefly brushing his skin as the knot was finalized. The silence of the crowd was absolute now, intensified by the incongruous sound of the lullaby. They watched, fascinated, repulsed, and utterly bewildered by the condemned man's composure. It was not the heroic defiance they might have expected, nor the weeping pleas for mercy. It was something far stranger, far more unsettling, an almost serene acceptance, underscored by a nursery rhyme. He thought of the little mouse in the song, burrowing deep into its cozy bed, safe from the winter winds, a small, insignificant creature finding its peace. He wondered, with a flicker of his old dark humor, if his own bed would be as warm, as deep, as eternally undisturbed. The thought brought another faint, private smile to his lips, hidden by the shadow of the noose. He was tired, bone-weary from the sleepless night, from the long, absurd performance of his life. Perhaps this was merely the prelude to the longest, deepest nap he would ever take. A peaceful sleep, unburdened by the need to find a new jest, to deflect a king's fury, to survive another day in a court that valued flattery over truth. Father Alaric, witnessing the Jester's almost otherworldly calm, muttered louder now, his prayers becoming a desperate plea for repentance, for a final acknowledgement of sin. He could not comprehend this bizarre composure, this humming on the very brink of damnation. It offended his sense of solemnity, his understanding of the proper order of things. A condemned man should be broken, fearful, begging for salvation, not serenading himself with a children's tune. But Barnaby heard only the low drone of his own humming, the rhythmic beat of the mouse's lullaby, a sound that insulated him, however briefly, from the terrifying reality of the rough rope against his neck. Grimshaw stepped back, his task completed. The noose was set. The trapdoor. Directly beneath Barnaby's feet was a dark, yawning rectangle in the gallows platform. The silence returned, thicker than ever, only now it was broken by the faint, persistent, almost maddening sound of Barnaby Button's humming. It was his final, quiet rebellion, a refusal to grant the king the dignity of his fear. He would not scream. He would not beg. He would simply hum, a small, insignificant tune, until the very end. The sun, climbing higher, cast a stark, unforgiving light on the scene, illuminating every detail, every tremor in the crowd, every flicker of emotion on the few faces that dared to show it. All that was left was the drop, and Barnaby, humming his mouse's lullaby, waited. Chapter 8. A Sudden Nap. The noose, thick and uncompromising, rested snug against Barnaby Button's neck, its coarse hemp a rough embrace. Grimshaw, the executioner, having completed his meticulous preparations, stepped back, his massive hands falling to his sides, poised. The air in Eldoria's market square had thickened into a palpable silence, a suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 held breaths, and the unspoken dread of the inevitable. The bright morning sun, now fully risen, cast long, stark shadows across the gallows platform, illuminating every detail with an unforgiving clarity. The grain of the rough-hewn oak, the worn fabric of Barnaby's motley, the single drooping bell on his cap. Father Alaric, his face a contorted mask of spiritual anguish, had ceased his frantic murmuring, his gaze fixed, horrified, on the Jester, as if expecting a final dramatic confession or a desperate soul-shaking plea. But Barnaby offered neither. He merely continued to hum. The tune, the simple, repetitive lullaby of the field mouse seeking its winter bed, had been a faint, reedy sound, barely audible beyond the immediate confines of the platform. It had been Barnaby's last defiant whisper against the solemnity of death, a deliberate injection of domestic absurdity into the grim proceedings. But now, as Grimshaw poised his hand over the lever of the trapdoor, a subtle shift occurred in the humming. It faltered, lost its rhythmic steadiness. The reedy notes grew softer, trailing off into indistinct mumbles like a candle flame guttering in a dying breeze. The faint sound of the jester's breath, once evenly accompanying the tune, became shallower, more punctuated by the occasional soft sigh. A flicker of confusion crossed Grimshaw's stony face. He watched Barnaby, his brow furrowed, his massive frame utterly still. The jester's head, which had been held with a strange, distant focus, began to droop. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it inclined forward, his chin coming to rest gently against his chest. The heavy knot of the noose shifting only slightly with the movement. His eyes, which had been fixed on an unseen point in the vast, indifferent sky, fluttered once, then twice, before closing entirely. A soft, almost contented exhalation escaped his lips, and the humming ceased altogether, replaced by the faint, rhythmic sound of deep, even breathing. Barnaby Buttons, professional jester, condemned man, was asleep. The sudden, utterly unexpected sight of the jester's sleeping form, swaying ever so slightly within the noose, hanging limply yet peacefully from the very instrument of his death, sent a collective ripple of disbelief through the assembled crowd. It was not a gasp of horror, nor a cry of outrage, but a strange, bewildered murmur that started at the front rows and spread outwards like ripples on a pond. Eyebrows furrowed, mouths fell open, then snapped shut, unsure whether to laugh, to cry out, or to simply stare. The silence, moments ago so heavy with dread, was now fractured by 1,000 whispered questions. Is he asleep? He can't be. How is a fool is he mocking us? Grimshaw, the executioner, was perhaps the most visibly baffled of all. His hand, which had been moments from engaging the lever, froze mid-air. He stared at Barnaby, then back at his hand, then at the sleeping figure again, as if the very laws of physics, or at least the established protocols of public execution, had suddenly gone awry. In all his years, in all the dozens of grim sentences he had carried out, he had never once encountered a condemned man who simply fell asleep. He had seen defiance, tears, raging fury, silent resignation, even the occasional fervent prayer, but never slumber. The sheer impropriety of it was almost offensive to his professional sensibilities. One did not simply take a nap on the gallows. It was against all tradition, all decorum. Father Alaric, who had opened his eyes just in time to witness Barnaby's silent descent into unconsciousness, let out a strangled cry, a sound torn from the very depths of his soul. He staggered back a step, nearly stumbling off the platform, his holy book falling unheeded from his trembling hands to land with a soft thud on the wood. Blasphemy! He seemed to silently shriek, his face pale as parchment, his eyes wide with unholy terror. Was this a manifestation of unrepentant sin, a final, damnable act of insolence? Or was it something far more unsettling, a sign of a mind unhinged, of a soul already adrift from earthly mooring? The priest had wrestled with Barnaby's flippancy during their brief, perfunctory confessions, trying to guide him toward spiritual contrition. But this was beyond his comprehension, beyond the scope of any holy text or theological doctrine. A man should face death with the solemnity it demanded, not with the gentle snore of a tired child. The crowd, however, felt a different kind of bewilderment. They leaned forward, straining their necks, trying to confirm the impossible. Yes, Barnaby Buttons, the jester, was indeed breathing slowly, deeply, his body limp and relaxed in the noose. A stray lock of hair escaping from beneath his cap swayed gently with his breath. It was an act so utterly unprecedented, so profoundly absurd, that it transcended the grim reality of the moment and tipped over into the realm of the truly bizarre. It was a jest, certainly, but one Barnaby seemed to be playing on himself, on the king, on the executioner, and on the entire assembled populace. Inside Barnaby's mind, There was only the vast, enveloping darkness he had so craved during the long, sleepless night. The damp chill of the dungeon, the cold dread of impending doom, the sharp wit that had kept him upright and performing. The biting irony of his final jocosol of it had receded into a hazy, indistinct background. He was no longer Barnaby Buttons, the condemned jester, but simply Barnaby, deeply, profoundly tired. The mouse's lullaby, which he had hummed as a defiant counterpoint to the gallows solemnity, had, with a strange irony, performed its intended purpose upon himself. It had lulled him. The exhaustion of the past weeks, the physical and mental strain of his imprisonment, and the relentless internal monologue had finally reached its breaking point. His body, having served its master's will for a final public performance, had simply decided to shut down, to seek the respite it had been denied. There was no pain, no fear, no conscious thought of the rope around his neck or of the trapdoor beneath his feet. Only the blessed velvety blackness of oblivion, the promise of a rest so profound it stretched beyond the boundaries of time. Earnshaw, after what felt like an eternity, finally lowered his hand. He looked at the guards flanking the platform, then back at Father Alaric, then at the unmoving, sleeping jester. What was he to do? An execution, by its very nature, required a conscious subject. To execute a man already in the throes of sleep felt undignified, unprofessionnel. It lacked the necessary drama, the final confrontation. More importantly, it lacked the punitive impact the king desired. A public execution was meant to be a warning, a spectacle of suffering and consequence. A sleeping man offered no such warning. He was simply absent. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder, more insistent, though still hushed. They were confused, but also strangely captivated. This was far more interesting than a straightforward hanging. This was an enigma, a puzzle for the ages. Was it a miracle? A curse? A final, unreadable gesture of Barnaby's unique brand of foolishness? The baker, Master Miller, nudged his neighbor. "Did you ever see the like?" He whispered, his eyes wide. "He's gone to sleep? On the gallows!" His neighbor merely shook his head, a mixture of awe and disbelief on his face. The small boy on his father's shoulders, seeing the jester still form, tilted his head. "Is he playing a trick, Papa?" he asked, his voice bright and innocent in the heavy air. His father shushed him, a new complex expression on his face. The sun continued its ascent, warming the air, but the scene on the gallows remained frozen, a tableau of profound absurdity. The executioner stood bewildered, the priest despaired, and the crowd watched, utterly baffled. And in the center of it all, suspended between life and oblivion, hung Barnaby Buttons, serenely, utterly, and most inconveniently asleep. The longest nap of his life, it seemed, had begun rather prematurely, right at the precipice of its scheduled start. The grand finale of this particular performance had taken a very unexpected and rather unexciting turn. The king's wrath, so carefully orchestrated to instill fear, had instead produced an unparalleled moment of public bewilderment. What was a king to do when his condemned prisoner simply decided mid-sentence to take a leisurely snooze? This was a problem for which no royal decree, no legal precedent, no amount of tyrannical fury seemed to offer a ready solution. The quiet, gentle breathing of the sleeping jester was the most profound, most unsettling defiance of all. Chapter 9. The Executioner's Dilemma. The profound silence that had descended upon Eldorius Market Square, a silence woven from anticipation and morbid curiosity, was now irrevocably shattered. It was not a sudden shriek, nor the clang of a dropped weapon, but a sound far more intimate, far more incongruous, that ripped through the heavy calm. It was a soft, rhythmic snore. Barnaby Buttons, professional jester, condemned man, lay slumped within the noose, his head resting gently upon his chest, emitting a steady, almost contented snuffle. The sound, initially faint, soon gathered an embarrassing momentum, evolving into a clear, albeit nasal, assertion of sleep, punctuated by occasional whistling inhales. Whistling inhales. It was the sound of a man truly, undeniably, and most impolitely, asleep. Grimshaw, the executioner, a man whose life was dictated by precision and grim ceremony, stood utterly flummoxed. His massive hands, which had so recently and expertly positioned the noose, now hung uselessly at his sides, as if suddenly unsure of their purpose. He stared at the jester, then at the lever of the trapdoor, then back at the jester's gently rising and falling chest. In all his years, through countless executions that had varied only in the condemned's final pleas or defiant curses, never had he encountered such an unforeseen complication. The protocol was clear. The condemned stood, faced his fate, and then dropped. There was no mention in the royal decrees on public demise about a subject who had, through sheer exhaustion or an inexplicable act of will, chosen to embark upon a spontaneous journey to the land of dreams. The snoring continued, a soft, almost vulnerable sound that nonetheless amplified the absurdity of the entire tableau. It cut through the solemnity, slicing it into ribbons of bewildered confusion. A public execution was meant to be a somber warning, a brutal display of the king's unyielding authority. It was meant to instill fear, to remind the populace of the dire consequences of disobedience. But how could fear take root when the very object of the king's wrath was serenely slumbering, oblivious to his own fate, seemingly more concerned with the quality of his hypothetical mattress than with the imminent threat to his neck? It made a mockery of the gallows, of Grimshaw's professional integrity, and most disturbingly, of the king's fearsome decree. A bead of sweat, cold and sharp, trickled down Grimshaw's temple, despite the crisp morning air. This was not the kind of problem for which his usual tools, the rope and the lever, offered a solution. Was he to shake the man awake? A sudden, jarring thought crossed his mind. What if he startled the jester, caused him to thrash, and thereby made the drop messy, undignified? No, that would be a breach of his own unspoken code. A clean, swift death was his responsibility, a mercy in its own grim way. But to send a sleeping man, unaware, into the void, it felt wrong, undignified for all parties involved, and certainly not the visual lesson King Thistlewick intended. Below, the crowd's bewilderment deepened into a complex mixture of expressions. The whispered questions intensified, becoming a low, agitated hum. Master Miller, the baker, blinked repeatedly, his flour-dusted hands rising to clutch at his throat. He had never seen such a thing. The young boy on his father's shoulders, initially confused, now began to giggle, a bright, clear sound that quickly cut through the murmuring. "He's sleeping, Papa," he exclaimed, pointing. His father, mortified, clapped a hand over the child's mouth, but not before the small, innocent laugh had infected others. A few nervous titters, quickly stifled, could be heard from various parts of the crowd. The intended solemnity had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy, almost surreal air. Father Alaric, who had collapsed onto his knees, his face buried in his hands, now lifted his head, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and incredulity. The snoring, so mundane, so unholy in its context, seemed to mock his very prayers, to scoff at the concept of a soul wrestling with its final moments. This was not the penitence he sought, not the fearful reverence that should accompany the journey to eternity. This was something entirely new, entirely unscripted, and utterly beyond his theological ken. Was it divine intervention, a sign that God himself found the king's sentence absurd? Or was it the devil's work, a final cunning trick to deny a soul its last chance at redemption? He shuddered, feeling the thin fabric of his faith fraying under the strain of Barnaby's utterly disrespectful nasal cadenza. Grimshaw looked towards the castle gates, half expecting a royal messenger to emerge, bearing new instructions. A desperate command to awaken the Jester, to force him to acknowledge his grim fate. But the gates remained closed, impenetrable, oblivious to the farcical scene unfolding in the square. The king, nestled in his chambers, was likely awaiting news of a swift, uneventful execution, a final triumph over impertinent metaphor. He would not, Grimshaw knew with a sudden sinking certainty, be pleased to hear that his carefully orchestrated spectacle had devolved into a public napping session. The snoring deepened, a particularly resonant snort escaping Barnaby's lips, causing his head to bob slightly within the noose. It was a clear, unmistakable sound of profound sleep, utterly devoid of any pretense or calculation. It was pure, unadulterated unconsciousness. Grimshaw felt a flush rise on his neck. His duty was to execute. His duty was to ensure the king's will was done, and seen to be done. But this was an affront to all established procedures. He could not, in good conscience, activate the lever while the man was entirely unaware. It would be less an execution and more akin to pushing a child from a bed. The very purpose of a public hanging, to terrify and deter, would be utterly lost. How could one be deterred by a man who simply drifted off to sleep? He considered his options, his mind, usually so direct, now swirling with an uncharacteristic uncertainty. Should he rouse him? A sharp clap, a loud shout. But that would break the absolute quiet, would make him appear clumsy, indecisive, before the assembled throng. And what if Barnaby, upon waking, launched into another one of his biting jests, mocking his own slumber, or worse, mocking Grimshaw's hesitant hand? The Jester had a knack for turning any situation into a spectacle of absurdity. No, rousing him was too risky, too unpredictable. Could he simply proceed, pretend the man was conscious, and get it over with? The thought lingered for a moment, appealing in its simplicity. But the snoring, it was impossible to ignore. It was a constant, auditory reminder of the Jester's oblivious state. It would be etched into the memory of every person in the crowd, a persistent echo that would forever undermine the severity of the king's judgment. The execution would become less a grim warning and more a peculiar anecdote, told and retold in taverns, likely with a fresh wave of quiet, subversive chuckles each time. Remember the Jester? Snored all the way to his end, he did. Grimshaw could almost hear the whispered words already, a corrosive humor eroding the king's power. The dilemma weighed heavily on him. His professional pride demanded a proper, solemn execution. The king's decree demanded the death of Barnaby Buttons. But the king's decree did not account for the Jester's uncanny ability to defy expectation even in his final moments. This was Barnaby's final, unexpected jest, and it was a masterpiece of passive defiance. He had robbed the execution of its very essence, its fear, its solemnity, by simply checking out of the proceedings early. The crowd continued to shift, a low, frustrated murmur rippling through them. They had come for a spectacle, for the decisive drop, the final, shuddering end. This prolonged, bizarre stalemate was not what they had paid, or rather stood to see. Their patience, like the morning dew, was slowly evaporating. Grimshaw felt their collective gaze. 1,000 unspoken demands for him to simply get on with it, but what it was he no longer knew. He sighed, a deep, frustrated exhalation that was swallowed by the strange quiet. This was not the ending he envisioned for a man who had insulted the king. It was too peaceful, too undignified for the punishment. But what alternative was there? He could not leave the man hanging, half hanged and half asleep, indefinitely. The king would demand an explanation. And what explanation could he give? Your Majesty, your Jester fell asleep. The very thought was absurd, a jester's jest in itself. Grimshaw, the embodiment of unwavering authority, was caught in the most peculiar, most embarrassing trap of his professional life, all thanks to a man who had decided to take a very ill-timed nap. The snoring continued, a gentle, rhythmic sound, the most profound mockery of power he had ever witnessed. Chapter 10. The King's Fury. The morning sun, though bright and clear in Eldoria's market square, barely penetrated the thick stained glass windows of King Thistlewick, the third's private breakfast chamber. He sat at a table laden with more delicacies than he could possibly consume, an array of poached eggs, smoked fish, sugared pastries, and various spiced meats, all meticulously arranged by nervous servants. His small, beveled hand toyed with a silver fork, his thin lips pursed in an expression of self-satisfied anticipation. He had risen early, dressed in his finest crimson velvet, and even donned a lesser, more comfortable crown, a smaller circlet of gold that, unlike his coronation behemoth, sat quite securely upon his head. Today was a day for the assertion of power, a public demonstration that King Thistlewick, though perhaps not the tallest of monarchs, was undeniably the firmest in his rule. The Jester Barnaby Buttons, that irritatingly witty little worm, was finally to pay for his insolence. The thought, a grim satisfaction, was sweeter than any honeyed tart on the table. A quiet rap, insistent and hurried, broke the genteel silence of the chamber. Thistlewick's head snapped up, his eyes, usually a dull gray, gleaming with impatient expectation. "Enter," he commanded, his voice sharp. A royal messenger, a young man named Cuthbert, whose face was perpetually flushed with anxiety, stumbled into the room, nearly tripping over his own boots. He was breathless, his brow slick with perspiration despite the cool morning air. He bowed so low his head almost touched the marble floor, then straightened, his eyes darting frantically towards the king, then away. "Well?" Thistlewick demanded, tapping his fork against the rim of his porcelain plate, a sound like tiny impatient bells. "Is it done? Is the foul jester dispatched? Tell me the details, boy. Was there weeping? Was there fear? Did he finally recognize the gravity of his impertinent metaphor?" The king leaned forward, his small eyes alight with eager malice. He envisioned Barnaby, trembling, perhaps even begging, a satisfying final image to banish the lingering sting of the jester's crude jest. Cuthbert swallowed hard, a prominent bob in his scrawny throat. He wrung his hands, his gaze fixed somewhere between the king's royal slippers and the ornate patterns on the carpet. "Your Majesty, it is not precisely as one might have expected." Thistlewick's face, moments ago animated by triumphant anticipation, slowly began to contort. A vein pulsed ominously in his temple. "Not as expected?" His voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous growl that had sent many a courtier scurrying for cover. "What treachery is this? Did the executioner botch it? Is the gallows faulty? Speak, worm, before I have your tongue nailed to the chamber door." "No, your Majesty, the gallows stands firm. Grimshaw is ready. It is the Jester Barnaby Buttons." Cuthbert finally managed to blurt out, his voice barely a squeak. He is asleep, your Majesty. He has fallen asleep." For a long, terrifying moment, absolute silence reigned in the breakfast chamber, a silence even more profound than that which had gripped the market square. King Thistlewick's hand, poised over a particularly plump sausage, froze. His eyes widened, then slowly narrowed until there were mere slits of incandescent fury. "Asleep," he hissed, the word tasting like venom on his tongue. "Did you say asleep? On the gallows? The very instrument of his rightful demise." Cuthbert nodded frantically, trembling from head to toe. "Yes, your Majesty. Deeply so." He was humming a lullaby, they say, and then just drifted off. The blood drained from Thistlewick's face, leaving it a ghostly white, before a tide of crimson surged upwards, suffusing his features with a terrifying apoplectic rage. The small crown on his head, the secure one, seemed to vibrate with his suppressed fury. A lullaby? He hums a lullaby? He and sleeps. The very audacity of it, the sheer, unmitigated insolence of a condemned man, refusing to even acknowledge his own execution, struck Thistlewick like a physical blow. It was an even greater affront than the initial joke, a mockery of his power that transcended conscious defiance. Barnaby Buttons, even in unconsciousness, was making a fool of him, of his justice, of his entire, carefully constructed image of formidable authority. He surged to his feet, overturning his chair with a crash that echoed through the room. The pastries and meats on the table vibrated, some sliding precariously towards the edge. He dares to sleep. He dares to find comfort in my judgment. This is not mere impertinence, Cuthbert. This is a direct assault on the very dignity of my throne. He mocks me even in his supposed final moments. He turns my solemn decree into a farce. The king's voice rose to a shriek, thin and reedy, yet piercing with unbridled wrath. He paced furiously, his small frame vibrating with indignation, his hands clenching and unclenching into impotent fists. "The crowd, your majesty," Cuthbert stammered. Emboldened, or perhaps just too terrified to stop speaking, they are bewildered. Some are even chuckling, quietly, but they are chuckling. It is not the solemn spectacle your majesty intended. This was the final unbearable insult. Chuckles. Barnaby, the fool, had managed to conjure laughter from his own death, undermining the very purpose of the execution. The king had wanted fear, had wanted a grim, undeniable display of his power. Instead, his jester, through an act of supreme, unconscious defiance, had transformed the gallows into a bizarre, slumbering sideshow. The whisper of the crowd, the imagined future ballads, the tales in the taverns, remember the jester who snored through his own hanging? What kind of king allows that? Began to fill Thistlewick's mind, each phantom whisper another twist of the knife. His fragile ego, so meticulously guarded, was laid bare, publicly ridiculed by a man who wasn't even awake. This is an outrage. Thistlewick roared, his face purpling. He snatched a silver goblet from the table and hurled it across the room. It struck the stone wall with a dull clang, leaving a dent in the precious metal. He will not deprive me of my just satisfaction. He will not make a mockery of my reign. This is more seditious than any metaphor. This is an act of supreme, contemptuous insolence. Wake him. Wake him by any means necessary. He spun on Cuthbert, his eyes blazing. Go. Go to Grimshaw. Tell him he is to proceed at once. I care not if the jester is dreaming of rainbows and fields of buttercups. I care not if he has found solace in the arms of oblivion. He will hang. And he will hang Hinove. If he cannot be roused, then he hangs as he is. Do you understand? The trapdoor will fall within the next minute, or by the gods, Grimshaw himself will find himself suspended from that very beam. Cuthbert recoiled, his face even paler than before. He had never seen the king in such a frenzy, a terrifying tempest of thwarted pride and impotent rage. But your majesty, to hang a man while he sleeps, he ventured, then immediately regretted it, as Thistlewick took a menacing step towards him. Silence! The king shrieked, his voice cracking with the strain of his fury. Are you questioning my decree, messenger? Are you implying that the king of Eldoria cannot command the very sleep from a condemned man's eyes? This is no longer about a joke. Cuthbert. This is about the unchallenged authority of the crown. It is about the very foundations of this kingdom. That fool, that sleeping, insufferable fool, has stolen the solemnity from my justice, and he will pay for it. His last act will not be a slumber, it will be a drop. He jabbed a finger, trembling with barely contained violence, towards the door. "Go! Tell Grimshaw to stop this ridiculous charade at once. Tell him to complete his duty. I want no more reports of snoring, no more whispers of chuckles. I want the silence of finality. I want the message sent. This is not merely a punishment. It is a lesson. And that lesson will be delivered, with or without the Jester's conscious participation." Cuthbert, needing no further encouragement, bowed again, a frantic, disjointed movement, and then scrambled backwards out of the chamber, his feet skittering on the polished marble. He imagined the scene in the square, the bewildered crowd, the sleeping Jester, Grimshaw's professional dilemma d'orty. Now he had to convey the king's incandescent rage, the absolute unyielding demand for immediate, undignified completion. He could almost hear the king's frustrated breathing, a series of short, sharp gasps echoing through the now empty chamber. Tislowick stood amidst the overturned chair and the scattered breakfast, his chest heaving, his face a mask of raw, visceral fury. The crown on his head felt heavier than usual, almost mocking in its secure presence. Barnaby Buttons, even in the depths of slumber, had managed to strip away the king's meticulously crafted aura of power, revealing the small, insecure man beneath. Joke, it seemed, was still very much on the king, and he, King Thistlewick III, would not suffer to be laughed at, not by a jester, and certainly not by a sleeping one. The execution would proceed, and with it, perhaps a new kind of legend would be born, one not entirely to the king's liking. Chapter 11. The crowd's uneasy laughter, the morning sun, now firmly established in the sky above Eldorius Market Square, did little to dispel the profound, almost tangible awkwardness that had settled over the assembled crowd. Barnaby Buttons, the condemned jester, remained exactly as he had been for several long, peculiar minutes, slumped within the thick noose, his head gently resting on his chest, a soft rhythmic snore emanating from his slightly parted lips. Grimshaw, the formidable executioner, stood frozen beside him, his massive hands hovering over the trapdoor lever, his granite-like face a mask of bewildered frustration. Father Alaric, having risen from his knees, hovered nearby, his holy book clutched to his chest like a shield against the unholy spectacle, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a profound sense of theological vexation. The silence, once heavy with anticipation, was now fragmented by the jester's indefatigable snore and the growing uneasy murmurs of the spectators. And then a new ripple of agitation swept through the crowd, a fresh disturbance on the surface of their collective bewilderment. A figure, breathless and disheveled, burst from the main castle gates, sprinting across the cobbled square with an urgency that spoke volumes. It was Cuthbert, the royal messenger, his face a ghastly shade of white, his usually neat livery askew, his hair plastered to his sweating brow. He weaved through the tightly packed bodies, muttering apologies and desperate pleas for passage, his eyes fixed on Grimshaw, his every movement radiating a terror far greater than mere physical exertion. The crowd parted for him, a wave of curiosity washing over their faces as they recognized the herald of the king's immediate will. Cuthbert scrambled onto the platform, stumbling slightly, his eyes wide and panicked as he finally reached Grimshaw's side. He bent over, gasping for breath, then straightened, forcing himself to speak, though his voice was a mere wheeze. "Master Grimshaw? His Majesty. He is furious. He demands the execution proceed at once. He knows of the hair. He knows of the jester's slumber. He cares not. He commands it. Now. Or else." Cuthbert finished, his voice breaking on the last word, glancing nervously towards the castle. Grimshaw's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching almost imperceptibly. The king's explicit command, delivered with such palpable fury, was undeniable. His dilemma, however, remained. To execute a man, a public spectacle, required a conscious subject. The solemnity, the didactic purpose, the very H-pointy of a public hanging, was utterly lost when the condemned was off in the land of dreams, snoring gently like a babe. It felt wrong, a profound breach of the unspoken, grim etiquette of his profession. But the king's wrath, as Cuthbert's trembling form attested, was a far more immediate and tangible threat than the ethical quandaries of executing a sleeping jester. Below, the crowd had overheard Cuthbert's frantic message, and a new wave of realization washed over them. The king knew. The king was enraged. And still, the jester slept. This was no longer just a bizarre, isolated incident. It was a direct confrontation between royal will and the most profound, most passive form of defiance imaginable. The tension in the square, previously a blend of morbid curiosity and bafflement, began to shift. A new emotion, unsettling and subversive, started to bubble to the surface. A small nervous titter escaped the lips of a woman near the front, quickly stifled by a hand clapped over her mouth. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. Barely audible, yet unmistakable. Then, a gruff, muffled snort from a burly farmer. He tried to turn it into a cough, but the telltale tremor of suppressed amusement was evident in his shoulders. The baker, Master Miller, who had been wringing his hands, suddenly let out a strangled chuckle, a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. He quickly looked around, his eyes wide with fear, but the spark had been lit. The absurdity of it all was simply too much to bear. The mighty King Thistlewick, renowned for his disproportionate temper, demanding the immediate execution of a jester who was too profoundly asleep to even notice. The snoring, once merely incongruous, now became an active participant in the farce, a relentless nasal counterpoint to the king's furious decree. Each gentle snuffle from Barnaby, each soft whistling breath, seemed to mock the rigid solemnity of the gallows, to chip away at the imposing dignity Grimshaw so meticulously cultivated. It was a cosmic jest, played out on the grandest, grimmest stage, and the audience, despite their fear, were finding it impossible to entirely resist the urge to laugh. The uneasy laughter began to spread, not in a loud, boisterous roar, but in a series of disjointed, nervous bursts. It was stifled, quickly cut short, often accompanied by worried glances towards the castle, or hushed whispers of "Don't you dare," from parents to their children. But it was there, a growing undercurrent of subversive amusement. A young stable boy standing on tiptoes behind a taller man suddenly slapped his hand over his mouth, his eyes crinkling at the corners as a silent giggle shook his small frame. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again with a shake of her head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips, a smile born of ancient wisdom and a deep appreciation for the ridiculousness of life, even at its bitter end. They were torn, these spectators. On one hand, the very real, very present threat of the king's arbitrary justice hung over them like the very noose above Barnaby's head. To openly mock the king's command, to find humor in such a dire moment, was to invite severe punishment. Yet, on the other hand, there was Barnaby, the jester who had lived his life by poking holes in pomposity now, even in unconsciousness, delivering the greatest, most devastating jest of all. He was defying the king, not with a brave, conscious act, but with the profoundly mundane act of taking a nap. It was a form of defiance so unexpected, so utterly illogical, that it bypassed fear and went straight for the funny bone. "He's certainly taking his final rest seriously," a voice murmured from the back, and a wave of quiet chuckles followed. "A jester even in his dreams," another whispered, and this time the chuckles were a little bolder, a little less stifled. The small boy on his father's shoulders, who had previously been silenced, now pointed again at Barnaby. "He's dreaming of crowns, Papa," he asked, his innocent question cutting through the tense atmosphere, drawing another burst of nervous, yet undeniable, amusement from those nearby. His father, instead of shushing him again, merely squeezed his shoulder, a troubled but perhaps amused look on his own face. Father Alaric, witnessing this unholy transformation of solemnity into uneasy farce, let out a distressed groan. He tried to appeal to Grimshaw, whispering frantically, "Master Grimshaw, this is a mockery. He must be roused. His soul must not be sent to judgment in such a state of irreverence. It is a sin against God and King." But Grimshaw, his eyes fixed on Barnaby's gently swaying form, merely grunted, his internal struggle now compounded by the king's explicit command and the growing, unsettling mirth of the crowd. The messenger, Cuthbert, seeing the growing levity, felt a fresh wave of despair. He had seen the king's fury firsthand. He knew what would happen if this scene persisted. He imagined King Thistlewick receiving a second report. "Your Majesty, the Jester is still asleep, and now the crowd is laughing." The image alone was enough to make him shudder. "Master Grimshaw," he hissed, his voice desperate. The king's command, now. But Grimshaw remained torn. He glanced at the sleeping Jester, then at the lever. The rhythm of the snoring was oddly soothing, almost hypnotic. It was the only sound that defied the weight of the crowd's gaze, the king's fury, priest's despair. It was Barnaby's final unwitting performance, a testament to a life lived in defiance of seriousness, a life that, even in its final moments, refused to be anything but absurd. The executioner, a man of simple, brutal tasks, found himself trapped in a quagmire of philosophical and comedic impossibility. The crowd's nervous laughter, once a faint rustle, was now a discernible murmur, a collective acknowledgment that on this peculiar morning King Thistlewick's power was being defied not by rebellion, but by a nap, and that, perhaps, was the greatest insult of all. The gallows, intended as a symbol of terror, had become the stage for the most ironic comedy Eldoria had ever witnessed, and all because Barnaby Buttons, utterly exhausted, had simply decided to nod off. The grand spectacle was utterly ruined, transformed by a snore and an impossible, unwavering sleep. Grimshaw's hand hovered over the lever, but the absurdity of the moment held it captive, locked in a strange, unwilling paralysis. Chapter 12. The Jester's peaceful end. Morning sun, now a brilliant, unblinking eye in the Eldorian sky, cast long, unwavering shadows across the market square, revealing every uncomfortable detail of the stalled execution. Barnaby Buttons, professional jester, condemned man, remained slumped within the thick embrace of the noose, his head gently bowed, the soft, nasal cadence of his snores cutting a profoundly absurd swath through the heavy air. Grimshaw, the hulking executioner, stood paralyzed, his massive hand hovering over the trapdoor lever, caught between the rigorous demands of his grim profession and the utterly unprecedented reality of a man taking a nap on the gallows. Cuthbert, the royal messenger, his breath still ragged from his frantic dash, writhed with visible anxiety at Grimshaw's side, his desperate pleas for immediate action echoing the incandescent fury of King Thistlewick. And the crowd, 1,000 souls strong, oscillated between horrified fascination and a nervous rising tide of uneasy laughter, each muffled chuckle a quiet betrayal of the solemnity the king so desperately craved. The tension on the platform became a living entity, thick and suffocating, wrapping around Grimshaw like an invisible rope. The king's command, relayed with such palpable terror by Cuthbert, was an undeniable force, a roaring torrent against the quiet, stubborn stream of the jester's slumber. Grimshaw had a duty, a direct order from the throne. His reputation, perhaps even his life, hung in the balance. But the sight of Barnaby, so utterly oblivious, so serenely at peace in his unconsciousness, continued to gnaw at his professional code. To drop a sleeping man felt less like an act of justice and more like a cruel, undignified prank. It lacked the necessary confrontation, the final, terrifying moment of realization that was meant to be the core of any public execution. Yet, the longer he hesitated, the more the king's fury would swell, and the more the crowd's uneasy amusement would fester, corroding the very authority he was meant to uphold. A particularly resonant snort, a soft whistling sound, escaped Barnaby's lips, causing his single remaining cap bell to jingle faintly, a tiny, mournful, yet undeniably comical sound. It was the straw that broke Grimshaw's internal dam. The Jester, even in oblivion, was mocking them all. He was defiling the gallows, twisting the solemn ceremony into a ridiculous sideshow. The king would never forgive such an affront. His decision, forced by the sheer, unyielding absurdity of the situation, hardened. He would not wake the Jester. He would not give him the dignity of consciousness. He would simply proceed. If Barnaby chose to sleep through his own demise, then so be it. It was a silent, grim capitulation to the Jester's unwitting defiance. With a deep, almost imperceptible sigh, Grimshaw's massive hand moved. There was no theatrical flourish, no shouted command, no dramatic pause for a final word. He simply gripped the lever, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The movement was swift, practiced, imbued with years of grim routine. There was a faint click, barely audible above the hushed, expectant murmuring of the crowd. Then, a soft, shuddering groan from the ancient oak timbers of the gallows itself. A sound like an old man waking with a start. The trapdoor, freshly oiled but still bearing the memory of countless prior uses, swung open with a muffled thud. Barnaby Buttons, Jester to King Thistlewick III, did not stir. His head, still resting gently on his chest, did not snap upwards. His eyes, closed in peaceful slumber, did not open. He simply dropped. It was a short, swift fall, a mere 6 feet or so into the waiting void beneath the gallows platform. The thick hempen rope, taut and unyielding, stretched with a sudden, sickening jolt. There was no flailing, no thrashing, no desperate struggle. There was only a quiet, almost graceful descent, a silent plummet into absolute stillness. The soft, rhythmic snoring which had so profoundly bewildered the crowd and exasperated the executioner ceased abruptly, cut off by the sudden, decisive snap. His body swung once gently, like a pendulum settling, then came to a complete, final rest. The single bell on his motley cap, shaken by the fall, let out a final, faint jingle. A sound so soft it might have been imagined, a ghostly echo of all his past performances. Now utterly, perfectly silent. A profound, different kind of silence descended upon the market square. It was no longer the silence of anticipation, nor the uneasy calm of bewilderment. It was the silence of finality, stark and absolute. But it was also, undeniably, the silence of continued bewilderment, of 1,000 unspoken questions. The crowd stared, utterly transfixed, at the still, limp figure hanging beneath the gallows. He hadn't woken. He hadn't fought. He had simply gone to sleep and stayed there, even through the moment of his own death. The sheer, audacious absurdity of it was almost too much to comprehend. The intended horror was there, certainly, the grim reality of a life extinguished. But it was inextricably tangled with an almost hysterical, dark humor, a sense of the utterly ridiculous. Father Alaric, witnessing the unprotesting, unwaking end of the Jester, fell back against the gallows upright, a strangled sob escaping his lips. He was not sure if it was sorrow for the man or profound despair at the utter lack of solemnity in his passing. How could a soul be properly ushered into the afterlife when it had not even been conscious for its departure? It defied every tenet of his faith, every lesson of his holy texts. Barnaby had truly utterly. Deed as he had lived, a riddle wrapped in motley, a defiance of all logic, a man who found the ultimate punchline in the most unexpected of places. Grimshaw stood, his hand still resting on the trapdoor lever, his face impassive once more, but his eyes held a distant, almost reflective quality. The task was done. The king's will, in its crudest form, had been carried out, but the manner of its execution that would haunt him. He had executed hundreds, but never one who had simply fallen asleep. The grim satisfaction of a job done gave way to a lingering sense of unsettling anomaly. Barnaby Buttons had not given him the dignity of a struggle, nor the theatricality of a final curse. He had simply given him the quiet, embarrassing gift of a snore, followed by an equally quiet, utterly peaceful oblivion. Below, the crowd remained frozen, their nervous chuckles dying in their throats, replaced by a collective, sustained intake of breath. The small boy on his father's shoulders, his face still innocent, finally grasped the finality. "He's not playing a trick anymore, Papa," he whispered, his voice small and uncertain. His father, his own face a complex mix of sadness and bewildered amusement, merely shook his head, unable to articulate the profound strangeness of what they had just witnessed. And so, Barnaby Buttons, the jester who had dared to lampoon a king's ill-fitting crown, slipped quietly from the realm of the living, never once waking from his profound slumber. His death was not a roaring climax of defiance, but a gentle, almost mundane sigh, a final, ironic punctuation mark on a life lived in absurd truth. He had denied the king the fear he sought, the grim satisfaction of a terrified, struggling subject. Instead, he had gifted Eldoria with a legend, a story that would be whispered in taverns and marketplaces for generations. The tale of the jester who snored through his own execution. It was a story brimming with the very irony he had championed in life, a testament to the enduring foolishness of power unchecked by humor, and the quiet, profound defiance of a man too tired, and perhaps too wise, to be truly afraid. His legacy was not one of rebellion, but of a quiet, subversive chuckle, a reminder that even in death a jester could find the ultimate, most inconvenient jest bite. King Thistlewick would receive his report, and in his rage he would miss the true, quiet, victorious punchline. Barnaby, even in his unwaking end, had proved that the joke was indeed still on the king, and he, at last, truly rested. Chapter 13. The aftermath, the precise, definitive snap, followed by the soft, almost graceful sway of Barnaby Buttons' limp form beneath the gallows, had silenced the crowd in Eldoria's market square more completely than any royal decree ever could. The nervous chuckles, the bewildered murmurs, the frustrated grunts of the executioner, and the frantic pleas of the messenger had all evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum of stunned comprehension. The sun, high and indifferent, continued to beat down on the scene, illuminating the still figure in his faded motley, his head lolling to one side, the solitary bell on his cap motionless. He was gone. He had not woken. He had not struggled. He had simply, and most inconveniently, taken his last, longest nap. For a long moment, longer than felt natural, the 1,000 eyes of the assembled townsfolk remained fixed on Barnaby. The air, once thick with anticipation, now felt heavy with a peculiar, almost reverent bewilderment. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire square had been frozen in a tableau, a testament to the utterly unprecedented nature of what they had just witnessed. Father Alaric, still clinging to the gallows upright, seemed to sag, his shoulders slumped in spiritual exhaustion, his earlier despair now compounded by an overwhelming sense of profound, theological discomfort. Grimshaw, his hand still on the trapdoor lever, finally released it, letting it fall back with a quiet click that echoed jarringly in the profound stillness. His face was a study in grim satisfaction, mixed with an unsettling, lingering perplexity. He had completed his duty, but not as it should have been. The order had been fulfilled, but the solemnity, the didactic purpose, the entire terrifying lesson of the execution had been utterly, irrevocably subverted by the Jester's final, unwitting act. Slowly, almost tentatively, the spell began to break. A woman in the front row let out a small, shuddering breath. A man beside her shifted his weight, his worn boots scraping on the cobblestones. The small boy, on his father's shoulders, who had been pointing at the Jester with a mix of wonder and innocence, finally turned his face into his father's shoulder, a single, silent tear, tracking a path through the dust on his cheek. The crowd, though still unwilling to fully disperse, began to stir, a low, hesitant hum replacing the absolute silence. It was a different kind of sound now, not of anticipation, but of disquieted contemplation. The first whispers began to spread as people cautiously started to move away from the gallows, their conversations hushed, almost conspiratorial. "He never woke," a voice murmured, laced with awe. "Not a peep, not a twitch. Asleep." All the way to the end, another echoed, a strange, almost admiring quality in the tone. The baker, Master Miller, slowly made his way through the thinning crowd, his eyes still wide. "A strange end," he said to no one in particular, his voice barely above a whisper. "A very strange end for a funny man." He felt a chill, not from the autumn air, but from the peculiar irony that clung to the square like a shroud. As the morning wore on, and the market square slowly reverted to its mundane purpose, though, with a lingering, almost sacred quietness around the gallows, the tale of Barnaby Buttons, final performance began to spread throughout Eldoria like wildfire. But it was not the tale of a condemned man, justly executed. It was the tale of the Jester who snored through his own hanging. It was whispered in the bakeries, debated in the taverns, retold in hushed tones over dinner tables, and recounted with wide, unblinking eyes by children in schoolyards. The narrative twisted and turned with each retelling, acquiring layers of embellishment and interpretation. Some said it was a miracle, a sign of divine disapproval of the king's cruel sentence. Only a man innocent in God's eyes could find such peace at the precipice. An old woman with deep-set eyes declared to her neighbors, nodding sagely. Others claimed it was a final, audacious, a supreme act of defiance, orchestrated by Barnaby, even beyond the grave. He mocked the king one last time, with the ultimate punchline. A grizzled old soldier muttered into his ale, a rare, genuine smile creasing his weathered face. Took the wind right out of his Majesty's sails, he did. This latter interpretation that Barnaby had somehow, through sheer force of his peculiar character, managed to subvert the entire solemnity of the execution, gained significant traction. It was not a rebellion, not an armed uprising, but a quiet, insidious form of mockery that began to eat away at the very foundations of King Thistlewick's authority. The public execution, intended to instill fear and enforce absolute obedience, had instead become a source of bewildered amusement and subversive humor. How could one truly fear a king whose condemned prisoner simply went to sleep? It made a mockery of his power, turned his wrath into a comedic footnote. The king's reputation, already precarious due to his short temper and even shorter stature, began to suffer irreparable damage. He was no longer merely seen as harsh or tyrannical. He was increasingly perceived as ridiculous. The very joke that had condemned Barnaby the king's head, too small for his crown, like a pigeon on a wobbly fence post, now gained new and bitter life. People would whisper about it, glancing at the king's guards, and then exchange knowing looks that held a new dangerous spark of shared understanding. The execution, meant to reinforce the gravity of the king's power, had instead inadvertently highlighted its fragility, its inherent absurdity when faced with such an unexpected passive form of defiance. In the taverns, new ballads began to circulate, sung in low voices, their verses filled with thinly veiled references to sleeping jesters and kings with ill-fitting crowns. They spoke of a monarch so consumed by his own petty pride that he would kill a man for a joke, only to have the man defy him even in death, by simply checking out. The humor was dark, certainly born of fear and resentment, but it was humor nonetheless, and it was corrosive. It eroded the fear, replacing it with a quiet, persistent contempt. The court itself was not immune. The nobles, who had so eagerly condemned Barnaby, now found themselves subtly embarrassed. Their performance of outrage had been exposed as the hollow charade it was. They knew, as everyone knew, that the king had made a fool of himself. And when a king is seen as a fool, his power, no matter how absolute, begins to fray at the edges. The royal historian, Master Elms, found himself increasingly agitated. His meticulously crafted charge of sedition by way of impertinent metaphor now sounded less like a grave legal pronouncement and more like a pedantic, self-important joke. He tried to argue for the profound solemnity of the execution, but his words rang hollow against the pervasive whispers of the sleeping jester. King Thistlewick, isolated in his castle, raged. Reports filtered back to him. The crowd had not been sufficiently terrified. They had laughed. They had whispered. They had been bewildered. And the jester, his insufferable jester, had not cried out, had not begged, had not even been conscious for his own demise. It was a failure, a colossal, humiliating failure. He ordered new decrees, forbidding any mention of the execution, threatening severe punishment for anyone caught repeating the jokes or ballads. But such edicts were like trying to bottle smoke. The story had taken on a life of its own, an intangible legacy woven into the very fabric of Eldorian lore. Barnaby Buttons, the jester who had often lamented his inability to truly move an audience, had, in his final unconscious act, achieved a legendary status far beyond anything he could have dreamed. He became a symbol, not of rebellion in the traditional sense, but of the quiet, enduring power of absurdity against tyranny, of ironic truth, against inflated ego. His death, meant to be a terrifying display of royal authority, had instead become a cautionary tale about the perils of fragile pride, and a testament to the fact that even in the face of absolute power, a good, bewildering joke could still have the last, most memorable laugh. He had not awoken, not even for the final plunge, slipping away into a peace that the king, for all his power and possessions, would never truly know. And in that quiet, unwaking end, Barnaby Buttons, the jester, had won. Chapter 14. The Ballad of the Sleeping fooled the peculiar quietness that clung to Eldoria's market square, a lingering echo of the unprecedented event, gradually dissipated, replaced by the mundane sounds of market life, albeit with a new, somber undertone. Yet the story of Barnaby Buttons, the jester who had snored his way to eternity, refused to fade. It whispered through the cobblestone alleys, drifted like smoke from tavern hearths, and resonated in the hushed conversations behind closed doors. It was a tale ripe for the telling, a bizarre, darkly humorous saga that demanded to be immortalized. And in Eldoria, as in any kingdom with a vibrant undercurrent of discontent, there was always a bard eager to pluck at the strings of truth, however inconvenient. That bard was a lean, perpetually hungry fellow named Finnegan Flicker. Finnegan was not a court bard, beholden to royal whims and the suffocating demands of flattery. He was a bard of the people, of the taverns and the marketplaces, his lute often battered, his voice sometimes hoarse, but his wit as sharp and cutting as a newly honed blade. He had been in the crowd that fateful morning, witnessing the entire bewildering spectacle from a precarious perch atop a cart of freshly spun wool. He had seen Barnaby's final, uneasy jest, heard his last defiant hum, and most memorably, had listened as the jester's rhythmic snore had cut through the solemnity of the gallows. He had felt the shift in the crowd, the nervous chuckles, the dawning realization of the profound absurdity. Finnegan, ever attuned to the pulse of public sentiment and the rich vein of human folly, knew he had struck gold, or rather a particularly dark, lustrous vein of Eldorian iron. This was a story that simply haughty to be sung. He spent the rest of that day, and much of the night that followed, hunched over his lute in a quiet corner of the Drunken Dragon Inn, ignoring the meager supper placed before him. His fingers, usually nimble and quick, moved slowly, deliberately, as he sought to capture the essence of the event. He worked on the meter, the rhyme, the precise turn of phrase that would perfectly encapsulate the bewildering defiance of Barnaby's end. He discarded verses that were too grim, too overt in their criticism, opting instead for the insidious power of irony and thinly veiled suggestion. The song had to be memorable, singable, and subtly yet undeniably mocking. It had to be a tune that would lodge itself in the minds of the people, a quiet, persistent hum of dissent against the fragile ego of their king. By the next evening, Finnegan was ready. The Drunken Dragon was unusually full, the lingering buzz of Barnaby's execution drawing curious patrons from every corner of Eldoria. There was a demand for answers, for interpretations, for something to make sense of the unsettling anomaly. Finnegan, standing on a sturdy wooden stool near the roaring fireplace, his lute held aloft, cleared his throat. The low hum of conversation slowly died down, replaced by a ripple of expectant silence. Everyone knew Finnegan. Everyone knew he had a knack for turning current events into memorable, often subversive, ballads. He began to strum a mournful yet oddly whimsical tune. His voice, usually a tenor, dropped to a low, almost conspiratorial murmur, then swelled with dramatic flourish. "Come gather round, ye folk of Eld, and listen to my tale of Barnaby, the jester bold, whose wit did often rail. He served a king, so grand and proud, whose head was rather small, and wore a crown, so rich and loud, that threatened oft to fall." A few nervous titters could be heard, quickly stifled. The familiar jest, now enshrined in song. Finnegan paused, letting the words hang in the air, his eyes scanning the faces in the shadowy room. He saw the baker, Master Miller, sitting near the front, his expression a blend of sorrow and something akin to a grim satisfaction. He saw others, their eyes wide, their lips pressed together, trying to suppress the smile that threatened to break through. The king, he wore his crown so high, a fortress on his brow, when Barnaby, with knowing eye, did make a simple vow. "Your Majesty," the jester said, "that crown so fine and grand sits like a plump pigeon on a post, the wobbliest in the land." A collective intake of breath. This was the forbidden joke, the very words that had condemned Barnaby, now sung aloud in a public house. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably, glancing towards the door, but most remained riveted, leaning forward, their apprehension battling with a deep, primal amusement. "The king!" he roared. A tiny storm, his face a purple hue, to dungeon deep, this mocking worm! His joking days are through. For sedition by metaphor, a charge both grand and grave, the jester faced the gallows door. No mercy could he crave. Finnegan's voice dropped again, imbued with a mock solemnity that was perfectly pitched to heighten the irony. He strummed a slow, mournful chord, then picked up the tempo, weaving in the strange twist of the tale. The morning came, the gallows tall. The crowd was gathered wide, for Barnaby to make his fall, with nowhere left to hide. The executioner, grim and stark, the noose so thick and strong. But Barnaby, he played a lark, and sang a sleepy song. The first ripples of genuine, though still nervous, laughter began to spread. Not the choked titters of the square, but a more confident, if still wary, mirth. The mention of the song, the very absurdity of it, was simply too much. He hummed a tune, a mouse's plight of winter's cozy bed, while Grimshaw, with a weary might, put rope around his head. He waited for a final word, a protest or a sigh, but Barnaby, so undisturbed, just closed his weary eye. The laughter grew louder, more widespread. It was an uneasy sound, tinged with the lingering fear of the king's wrath, but it was laughter nonetheless. It was the sound of a people finding their voice, their shared understanding of the ridiculous, in the face of absolute power. He snored a snore so soft and deep, upon that wooden stage, while King Thistlewick from Castle Keep did fly into a rage. "He sleeps," the royal messenger cried. "He scoffs at your decree." But Barnaby his soul defied, for slumber set him free. This verse, with its direct reference to the king's fury and the jester's unruffled slumber, was a masterful stroke. It explicitly laid bare the core irony, the complete subversion of the king's intent. The laughter in the inn swelled, a nervous, almost rebellious roar, quickly choked off by a loud thumping on the table from Master Miller, who, despite himself, was now shaking with silent, hysterical mirth. They dropped the plank with solemn sound. The jester made no plea, his silent end, upon the ground for all the world to see. No final word, no terrified gasp, no struggle fierce and grim. He left the king with naught to clasp, but a legend born of him. Finnegan's voice rose to a crescendo, then softened, ending on a lingering, almost melancholic note. So now they tell in whispered tones, by hearth and market stall, of Thistlewick, who shattered bones for a crown that threatened to fall, and Barnaby, the sleeping fool, whose joke was clear and plain. He taught the king a bitter rule: you cannot conquer brain, nor laughter, nor the quiet wit that seeks a truth so deep, for even in a final fit, a jester finds his sleep. The final lines, both tragic and triumphantly ironic, hung in the air. For a moment there was silence, a stunned pause. Then a roar erupted. Not just laughter, but cheers, foot-stomping, and the clattering of tankards. It was a release, a collective acknowledgment of a truth that had been silently understood but rarely articulated. Finnegan, bowing low, his face alight with a quiet satisfaction, knew he had succeeded. The ballad, his ballad of the sleeping fool, would spread beyond the drunken dragon, beyond Eldoria itself. It would be carried on the winds, hummed by travelers, sung by other bards in distant inns. It would be modified, embellished, but its core truth, the absurdity of power when faced with profound, unwitting defiance, would remain. King Thistlewick, isolated in his castle, raged at the continued reports of the jester's enduring infamy. He commanded scribes to write official accounts, condemning Barnaby as a malicious, unrepentant traitor who had feigned sleep out of spite. He dispatched guards to silence the bards, to forbid the singing of Finnegan's ballad. But it was like trying to scoop water from a river with a sieve. For every bard silenced, another would rise, drawn by the power of the tale. For every whispered conversation suppressed, two more would begin. The more the king tried to eradicate the legend, the more deeply it embedded itself in the popular consciousness. Barnaby Buttons, the jester, had indeed found his peaceful end, a rest so deep it had transcended the very act of death. And in that quiet, unwaking oblivion, he had achieved a lasting legacy that no conscious act of rebellion could have ever secured. His mocking song, penned by Finnegan Flicker, became his true coronation, a crown of irony placed firmly upon his memory, a perpetual reminder that some truths, once spoken, even in jest, could never truly be silenced, and that even the most fearsome king could be undone by a simple, ill-timed, but profoundly meaningful nap put-put-dee. Yoke had cost him his life, but it had won him immortality, a legend etched not in stone, but in the enduring uneasy laughter of a kingdom. Chapter 15. The King's Regret. The heavy velvet drapes in King Thistlewick, the Third's chambers, usually drawn to exclude the world and its inconvenient truths, seemed now to trap the cold, thin light of dawn, refusing to let it penetrate the oppressive gloom within. He lay, or rather tossed, in his silken sheets, the elaborate embroidery of his royal crest digging uncomfortably into his back, a constant, nagging reminder of the very status that felt increasingly like a torment. Sleep, once a loyal servant that had readily claimed him after a day of pomp and pronouncements, had deserted him entirely since the execution of Barnaby Buttons. Each night, as the castle settled into a deceptive quiet, the king's mind would begin its relentless, unwelcome performance. It was not the image of Barnaby struggling or pleading, or even cursing that haunted him. No, such scenes would have been a balm, a satisfying confirmation of his power. What tormented King Thistlewick was the profound, infuriating image of the Jester's utterly serene, unflinching slumber. The memory of Cuthbert's breathless report, the messenger's wide, panicked eyes recounting the soft, rhythmic snore that had cut through the solemn silence of the gallows, played endlessly in his mind like a broken harp string. Each note, a fresh stab of impotent fury. He would close his eyes, desperate for oblivion, only to conjure the phantom sound of that damnable snore, a sound so innocuous yet so devastatingly defiant. It was a sound that had mocked his power, twisted his solemn justice into a bewildering farce, and, worst of all, he knew, had secured the Jester an ignominious, yet enduring, form of triumph. He would rise often before the first light, his small frame trembling not from cold, but from a simmering internal rage that had nowhere to go. He would pace his chambers, the thick carpets muffling his restless footsteps, his mind churning with increasingly paranoid thoughts. He saw Barnaby's silent, sleeping face in the patterns on the tapestries, heard his phantom snore in the creak of the ancient timbers. He would stand before his mirror, adjusting his smaller, more secure crown, staring at his reflection, and in his own eyes he would see not the mighty monarch he so desperately yearned to be, but a man perpetually overshadowed by a Jester who had found a more profound peace in death than the king could ever hope to attain in life. The crown, once a source of comfort and validation, now felt like a lead weight upon his head, a constant physical manifestation of the very insecurity Barnaby had dared to expose. The court, once a bastion of sycophantic flattery, now felt subtly, unnervingly different. Courtiers still bowed, still offered lavish compliments, but Thistlewick, his senses honed by paranoia and sleeplessness, detected a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in their voices, a fleeting avoidance in their eyes. He would catch hushed whispers that would instantly cease upon his approach, a collective turning of backs, a sudden, inconvenient interest in a distant tapestry. He knew they were talking about it. They were whispering about Barnaby. They were chuckling. Quietly, oh so quietly, but he could almost feel their amusement, a corrosive acid eating away at the edges of his authority. His attempts to forbid any mention of the execution, to threaten dire consequences for those who dared to repeat the Jester's jokes or Finnegan Flicker's increasingly popular Ballad, proved utterly futile. Such edicts merely served to drive the whispers deeper, to turn the Ballad into a forbidden anthem of quiet defiance. He dispatched guards to various taverns, to silence Finnegan, to confiscate lutes and smash them against walls. But Finnegan, like a particularly agile shadow, always seemed to melt away before the guards arrived, leaving behind only the lingering resonance of his mocking verses. And for every lute smashed another appeared, crafted in secret, ready to carry the tune of the sleeping fool. The more he tried to suppress it, the more vibrant the legend of Barnaby Buttons became, nurtured by the very fear the king sought to instill. This was not the kind of fear he wanted. It was a fear mixed with derision. with a chilling undercurrent of shared, subversive humor. One evening, as he sat alone in the great hall, a cavernous space now filled with a crushing silence rather than the usual clamor of banquets, a faint, melancholic melody drifted in through an open window. It was Finnegan's Ballad, sung by a group of laundresses by the river, their voices clear and surprisingly strong in the crisp night air. He caught snippets. He hummed a tune. A mouse's plight. Barnaby, so undisturbed, just closed his weary eye. He snored a snore, so soft and deep, he left the king with naught to clasp, but a legend born of him. Each line was a fresh, agonizing barb. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the tune had already lodged itself in his mind, intertwining with the phantom snore, becoming a perpetual, unwelcome soundtrack to his life. His advisers, once so quick to validate his every whim, now seemed hesitant, their eyes downcast when he proposed new, increasingly harsh decrees to quell the Barnaby problem. Master Elms, the royal historian, who had so eloquently crafted the charge of sedition by way of impertinent metaphor, now looked perpetually unwell, his face pale, his hands trembling even more than usual. He stammered when the king demanded an explanation for the public's continued insolence, unable to offer a solution to a problem that defied all logic and precedent. How could one punish a legend? How could one silence a shared understanding? The king began to question, not aloud, but in the desolate chambers of his own mind, the very decision that had brought him to this wretched state. Was it worth it? Had the cost of his pride, the desperate need to assert his authority against a trivial jest, truly been worth this constant torment? He had wanted to send a message, to instill absolute obedience. Instead, he had created a martyr of quiet defiance, a symbol of ridicule. He had sought to demonstrate his fearsome power, but had only revealed his profound insecurity. He had executed a jester, but in doing so, he had, in effect, executed a part of himself, the part that could still command genuine respect, the part that was not perpetually haunted by the sound of a simple snore. He found himself wandering the castle corridors late at night, his bare feet cold on the stone, his mind unable to find rest. He would pass the empty jester's quarters, the door standing ajar on occasion, revealing the sparse, unadorned room that had once housed Barnaby Buttons. He would imagine the jester there, perhaps practicing a new trick, or simply humming that ridiculous lullaby. And a strange, unfamiliar emotion would stir within him, something akin to a desolate loneliness. He had banished the laughter from his court, not just Barnaby's, but all genuine, spontaneous mirth, replacing it with a tense, brittle silence. The court was quieter now, certainly, more obedient, perhaps, in their overt actions. But beneath the surface, a subtle, insidious subversion had taken root, watered by the memory of a sleeping fool and a king whose crown now felt heavier than ever. The cost of his pride, he realized with a bitter internal sigh, was not merely the loss of a jester or the erosion of his fearsome reputation. It was the loss of his own peace. He, King Thistlewick III, the absolute monarch of Eldoria, could no longer sleep. And the jester, Barnaby Buttons, the man he had condemned for a joke about a wobbly crown, was sleeping soundly, eternally, utterly undisturbed by the furious, restless ghost of the king who had ordered his death. The ultimate, bitter jest he finally understood was on him. And it was a joke that would never cease to be told, not in words, but in the persistent, phantom echoes of a snore and the quiet, knowing glances exchanged throughout his kingdom. He was a king, but he was also now a sleepless, haunted fool. Chapter 16. The Jester's Ghost. The chill of Eldoria's night, once a mere physical sensation, had become a haunting, pervasive presence in King Thistlewick III's chambers, seeping into the very marrow of his bones. Sleep, that elusive, mocking mistress, continued to elude him, her absence a gnawing torment far more effective than any dungeon rack. He lay or paced or sat slumped in his throne, his small restless eyes darting into every shadow, convinced that the spectral snore of Barnaby Buttons, the jester he had so foolishly, so irrevocably dispatched, was lingering in the very air he breathed. The memory of the execution, meant to be a potent demonstration of his fearsome power, was instead a festering wound in his pride, a constant, humiliating reminder that even in death, the jester had managed to steal his solemn spectacle and turn it into a bizarre, slumbering farce. But now, the torment had taken a new, more insidious form. The whispers had begun. Not just the hushed murmurs of the townsfolk recounting the ballad of the sleeping fool, but a new kind of whisper, one that snaked through the castle corridors like a cold draught, reaching even the most guarded ears. Whispers of Barnaby's ghost. Not a terrifying, clanking specter, but something far more unnerving. A lingering presence, a mischievous, ethereal entity that seemed determined to continue its jester's duties, specifically aimed at the king, who had silenced him. It started subtly. King Tislowick, who had taken to wearing his lesser, more secure crown even during his troubled sleep, would occasionally wake to find it askew, not merely tilted, but precariously balanced on the very edge of his headboard, or more maddeningly, perched atop a forgotten chamber pot. He would snatch it up, his heart hammering in his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. He would question his sleepy guards, his trembling servants, who would only offer bewildered shrugs and stammered denials. Who could have entered his royal bedchamber? No one. And yet, the crown had moved, always to a place that hinted at precariousness, at ill-fitting dimensions. Then came the bells. Small, faint jingles, often heard in the dead of night. Not the loud, brassy clang of a chapel bell, but the soft, almost ghostly chime of a jester's cap bell, delicate and persistent. Tislowick would bolt upright in bed, his breath catching in his throat, straining to locate the source. Sometimes it seemed to come from just outside his chamber door, a faint, taunting melody. Other times it echoed from the empty jester's quarters down the corridor, a mournful yet undeniably cheeky sound. He ordered the jester's room sealed, its contents removed, but still, in the quietest moments, the phantom jingle would return, a small auditory reminder of the fool he had silenced. His court, observing the king's increasing paranoia and sleeplessness, fueled the rumors, albeit discreetly. They spoke in hushed tones of cold spots in the great hall, of doors that swung open and closed with no apparent breeze, of objects inexplicably falling from shelves or shifting position. No one directly implicated Barnaby's ghost, of course. That would be an admission of belief in such an absurd notion, and a tacit insult to the king's wisdom. But the knowing glances, the barely suppressed smiles, the exaggerated shivers they displayed when recounting these strange occurrences all served to deepen the king's conviction that something unnatural was afoot. The most unsettling pranks, however, occurred in the king's restless sleep. He would dream, not of triumphant battles or adoring subjects, but of the gallows. He would find himself standing on the platform, not as the monarch, but as the condemned, the thick noose around his neck. And then Barnaby would appear, not as a silent, lifeless body, but as a vibrant, mischievous figure, tumbling and juggling invisible crowns, his eyes twinkling with a profound, knowing amusement. The jester would point at Thistlewick's neck, then at his own, then shrug, as if to say, "See, it was all rather simple, wasn't it?" And the dream would dissolve into the sound of Barnaby's maddening, rhythmic snore, so loud, so pervasive, that it would wrench the king awake, gasping for air, the phantom sound lingering in the oppressive silence of his bedchamber. He started to find small, ridiculous alterations to his royal wardrobe. A seamstress swore she had finished his favorite ceremonial cloak to perfection, only for the king to find one of its sleeves subtly, comically shortened, rendering it utterly unwearable for a royal procession. His carefully selected shoes, designed to add inches to his stature, would sometimes be found filled with small, harmless pebbles, just enough to cause an annoying discomfort, but never enough to be truly damaging. He raged, he demanded explanations, he threatened the entire royal household staff with dismissal, but no one could account for these subtle, irritating defacements. They were too minor to be acts of overt sabotage, yet too consistently inconvenient to be mere accidents. It was as if Barnaby, from beyond the veil, was still pulling his subtle, truth-telling pranks, highlighting the king's vanity and perpetual discomfort. His private papers, sealed and locked away, would occasionally be found slightly disturbed. Not stolen, not even read, but merely rearranged. Perhaps with a particularly dull decree placed prominently at the top, or a detailed plan for a new, oversized statue of the king, inexplicably folded into the shape of a small, plump bird. It was always harmless, always just frustrating enough to make the king question his own sanity. He would order new locks, new guards, double the vigilance, but the quiet, unseen hand of the Jester's ghost seemed to bypass all earthly barriers. The king's meals, too, became suspect. A particularly rich stew, usually his favorite, would occasionally be found to have a peculiar, almost undetectable bitter aftertaste, or a sweetness that lingered unpleasantly on the tongue. He would push it away, disgusted, convinced that a subtle, undetectable poison was at play, though his royal tasters would always declare it perfectly safe. He began to pick at his food, his appetite dwindling, his once robust constitution slowly weakening under the relentless strain of paranoia and hunger. The court chroniclers, under the king's strict orders, continued to produce elaborate, highly flattering accounts of his reign, meticulously omitting any mention of the unfortunate Jester. But even their parchments seemed to turn against him. One morning, the king found a freshly penned decree outlining new taxes on peasants' chickens with a small, barely visible doodle in the margin, a tiny, crudely drawn crown perpetually wobbling atop a disproportionately small head. The scribe, a perpetually nervous man named Master Quill, swore on his mother's grave that he had not drawn it, that it must have been a trick of the light, a smudge. But the king knew. He knew the style, the particular infuriating clarity of the observation. It was Barnaby's mark. Disselwick tried various remedies for his sleeplessness. Potions brewed by the royal alchemist, charms whispered by wizened old women, even harsh sedatives prescribed by the royal physician that left him sluggish and ill-tempered, but never truly rested. For even when the chemicals dragged him into a brief, dreamless stupor, he would still wake with the chilling sensation of a cold feather brushing his nose, or a faint disembodied chuckle echoing in his ears, or the distinct, unmistakable feeling that a tiny invisible bell had just jingled beside his pillow. He became obsessed with the empty Jester's quarters. He would stand outside the sealed door for hours, listening, straining to hear any sound, any confirmation of the lingering presence that haunted his waking and sleeping hours. He considered exorcists, priests of every denomination, mystic recluses from the distant mountains, but his pride held him back. To admit to a haunting, to confess that a mere Jester was tormenting him from beyond the grave, would be an even greater humiliation than the initial execution. It would confirm to his court and to his kingdom that Barnaby, even in death, held more power over him than he. The king held over his own trembling mind. His appearance began to change. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot, sunken in dark hollows. His complexion grew sallow, his movements jerky and agitated. He lost weight, his already small frame becoming gaunt. His temper, always volatile, now flared at the slightest provocation, disproportionate and terrifying. He would lash out at servants for imagined slights, accuse courtiers of disloyalty for a casual glance, and order guards to search empty rooms for phantom presences. His once booming, if reedy, voice became a rasping whisper, punctuated by sudden, involuntary shivers. The court, though outwardly deferential, spoke of the king's affliction in hushed, pitying tones. They saw not a tyrannical monarch, but a haunted man, a prisoner of his own cruelty and pride. The irony was not lost on them. The king had wanted to erase Barnaby, to silence his laughter forever. Instead, Barnaby's laughter, in the form of these subtle, maddening pranks, had become the king's constant companion, echoing in the emptiness of his sleepless nights, forever reminding him of the jester who had dared to speak truth to power, and who, even from the grave, refused to let the king forget it. The greatest jest, it seemed, was still unfolding, and King Thistlewick, utterly tormented, was its unwilling, perpetually sleepless audience. Barnaby Buttons, the jester, had indeed found his eternal rest, while the king, in his gilded cage, found only the relentless, mocking presence of a ghost that refused to let him sleep, a ghost that merely hummed and snored and rearranged crowns, forever ensuring that the joke was and always would be on the king. Chapter 17. The Legacy of Laughter. The market square, once cleared of Barnaby Button's suspended form and the last lingering scent of damp rope, quickly resumed its daily rhythm. But it was a rhythm subtly, irrevocably altered. The cries of vendors, the clatter of hooves, the endless hum of commerce, all carried a new, almost imperceptible undertone, a faint echo of the profound absurdity witnessed on the gallows. The immediate, collective gasp of disbelief had given way to a shared, bewildered silence, and that silence in turn dissolved into 1,000 hushed conversations that rippled outwards from the square like an invisible touch. The story, Barnaby's final, unwitting performance, was no longer merely a morbid curiosity. It was something far deeper, far more resonant, embedding itself into the very fabric of Eldorian life. People spoke of it not as a grim execution, but as the peculiar incident, the strange spectacle of the jester who had fallen asleep, the sheer, audacious normalcy of Barnaby's final state, the gentle snore. The peaceful repose had robbed the event of its intended terror, replacing it with a bewildering, almost surreal humor. It was this incongruity, this juxtaposition of the ultimate solemnity with the most mundane of human frailties, that made the tale so potent. How could one truly fear a gallows that had served as a bed for the condemned? How could one truly tremble before a king whose ultimate punishment had been subverted by a simple, ill-timed nap? The narrative of Barnaby Buttons quickly shed its initial layers of shock and disbelief, evolving into a quiet legend, a shared secret among the common folk. In the bakeries, where the scent of warm bread usually dominated, whispered accounts of Barnaby's placid face competed with the ringing of coins. Master Miller, the baker, often found himself recounting the scene to curious patrons, his flour-dusted hands animated as he described the jester's unwavering slumber. He would finish with a shake of his head, a complex expression on his face that was part sorrow, part bewilderment, and part a nascent, quiet amusement. He never woke, you see, Master Miller would say, his voice hushed. Not a peep. Just peace. And in those simple words, a subtle defiance bloomed. In the taverns, where Finnegan Flicker's ballad had taken root, the tale was sung with increasing confidence. The fear of the king's spies, while still present, was often drowned out by the collective, uneasy laughter that accompanied the verses about Thistlewick's small head and Barnaby's undisturbed rest. The song, once a daring act of public subversion, became a communal ritual, a way for the people to acknowledge the truth of their king's tyranny without overtly challenging it. It was a shared wink, a collective shrug in the face of absolute power, and in that shared understanding, a fragile seed of resilience began to sprout. The humor was dark, certainly, born of the grim reality of their lives, but it was humor nonetheless, a vital counterpoint to the relentless seriousness of their monarch. Children, too, carried the legacy. They would play games in the muddy streets, reenacting the scene, one child flopping limply in a makeshift noose of rope, while another pretended to snore with exaggerated gusto. Their innocent mimicry, devoid of the adult understanding of death, nonetheless magnified the absurdity of the original event, turning the king's terrible judgment into a playground jest. Parents who might have scolded them for such macabre play before, now often watched with a strange contemplative look, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on their lips. They were seeing their own silent defiance reflected in their children's games. This was the essence of Barnaby's true triumph, his ability to transform the ultimate act of oppression into a source of quiet, enduring ridicule. He had not led a rebellion with swords and banners. He had initiated a revolution of chuckles and whispers. King Thistlewick had wanted his death to be a terrifying deterrent, a clear message of absolute control. Instead, it had become a persistent, humiliating anecdote. The king, in his blind rage, had focused on the physical elimination of the Jester, failing to understand that Barnaby's true power lay not in his physical presence, but in his jides, in his uncanny ability to expose the foolishness behind the facade of power. And a sleeping Jester, turned out, was far more effective at exposing that foolishness than a struggling, defiant one. The legacy of laughter began to manifest in subtle, yet undeniable, ways throughout Eldoria. When royal decrees were posted, announcing new taxes or stricter regulations, people would gather, read them, and then exchange quiet glances, a faint, knowing smile passing between them. The king's bombastic language, once intended to inspire awe and obedience, now seemed to carry an almost comedic undertone. They imagined Barnaby's phantom snore echoing through the royal chambers as the decrees were drafted, turning the serious pronouncements into a continuation of the Jester's final, unscripted performance. This was not outright defiance, no shouted protests or public acts of rebellion. It was far more insidious, a quiet, internal subversion, a refusal to grant the king the dignity of their genuine fear. Even the most loyal of courtiers, those who clung desperately to their positions by means of unwavering flattery, found themselves occasionally slipping. A nervous cough that sounded suspiciously like a suppressed chuckle during a particularly grand royal address. A fleeting, almost imperceptible glance towards a colleague when the king's crown seemed to shift on his head. King Thistlewick, consumed by sleeplessness and growing paranoia, noticed these tiny cracks in the facade of deference, and they only fueled his torment. He knew they were talking, he knew they were laughing, and the fact that he could not grasp the source of this quiet subversion, could not crush it with his usual brute force, drove him further into his solitary gilded madness. The king's attempts to suppress the narrative were utterly futile. He ordered patrols to break up gatherings, banned singing in taverns, and threatened any who spoke of the Jester with dire consequences. But the story, like water, simply found new channels. It flowed through the quiet whispers of grandmothers to their grandchildren, through the unspoken understanding between neighbors, through the very air of shared experience. It transformed from a simple tale into a symbol of resilience, of the quiet power of the common folk to find humor and truth, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. Barnaby Buttons, the humble Jester, had become a folk hero, not through glorious deeds, but through a deeply ironic, utterly passive act of defiance. The weight of this unseen, intangible resistance pressed down on King Thistlewick more heavily than any crown. He could not fight a ghost that hummed, a legacy that snored, a legend that merely whispered and chuckled. His realm, once seemingly under his absolute control, felt porous, permeated by an invisible, subversive current of amusement. He had wanted to be feared, respected, unchallengeable. Instead, he was becoming a figure of ridicule, forever linked to the image of a small, wobbly crown and a sleeping Jester. The grand spectacle of his power had been utterly undone by a moment of profound, unintended human frailty. In the quiet corners of Eldoria, far from the king's paranoid gaze, the tale of Barnaby Buttons was a source of comfort, a reminder that even the most fearsome power could be undermined by the simple truth, delivered with a hint of absurdity. It taught them that laughter, even uneasy laughter, could be a shield against despair, a small but potent act of reclaiming dignity in a world that often sought to strip it away. The Jester had died, but his spirit, his unique brand of ironic wisdom, lived on, echoing in the quiet chuckles and knowing glances that passed between the people. And so, Barnaby Buttons, in his eternal, unwaking slumber, continued to play his greatest joke. He had achieved a form of immortality, a permanent place in the collective consciousness of Eldoria, a place of quiet reverence and subversive amusement. His legacy was not written in stone, nor etched in the grand annals of the court, but woven into the everyday fabric of his kingdom, a persistent, gentle hum of laughter against the backdrop of tyranny. The king remained sleepless, haunted by the ghost of a snore, while the Jester, even in death, granted his people the quiet, comforting knowledge that sometimes the most profound truth could be found in the most absurd of places, and that even the gravest of sentences could be turned into the most memorable of jokes. Chapter 18. The fool's final rest, the moments immediately following Barnaby Buttons' quiet, unwaking descent were consumed by a profound, disorienting stillness. Grinshaw, the executioner, his duty grimly fulfilled, ordered the guards to cut the body down. It was a perfunctory, unceremonious act, devoid of any dignity, conducted as swiftly as possible to clear the gallows and restore some semblance of order to the bewildered square. The king had given no instructions for the Jester's burial, a deliberate oversight meant to deny him any final resting place that might invite veneration. And so Barnaby's limp form, still clad in his faded motley, with the single, motionless bell on his cap, was wrapped in a coarse, undyed canvas and carried away, not to the hallowed grounds of the royal cemetery, nor even to the common burial plots where families mourned. Instead, under the cloak of twilight, too silent, anonymous guards bore him to a patch of neglected ground, just beyond the old city walls, near the forgotten ruins of a crumbling watchtower, where the wild thistles grew thick, and the wind whistled a lonely tune. There, in the shallow, unhallowed earth, without coffin or ceremony, they dug a hurried hole, lowered the bundled form, and covered it with rough soil and a scattering of stones. There was no marker, no name, no epitaph, only the silent, indifferent earth. It was, by all accounts, an ending designed for utter oblivion, a final erasure of a life deemed inconvenient. But in Eldoria, as in any place where power sought to control narrative with an iron fist, such deliberate acts of forgetting often had the opposite effect. The very absence of a marker, the deliberate namelessness, only deepened the mystery and intensified the legend. People whose lives were marked by the tangible presence of their dead found themselves drawn to the intangible. They knew, though no one would say how, that the Jester lay somewhere beyond the crumbling wall, under the thistles and the whispering wind. It was a secret passed in hushed tones, a quiet pilgrimage to an unmarked grave. The first to seek it out was Master Miller, the baker. His heart, usually lightened by the scent of fresh dough, had carried a strange, heavy ache since that bewildering morning. He had seen Barnaby's face, peaceful even in the Noose, heard his last impossible snore. It was a sight that gnawed at him, a poignant absurdity that demanded a response. One evening, under the pale shroud of a half-moon, he ventured beyond the city walls, guided only by a vague sense of direction and the persistent pull of his own conscience. He stumbled upon the thistle-choked rise, a desolate place, and felt, rather than knew, that this was it. He knelt, his flour-dusted hands resting on the cold earth. And with a quiet sigh, he unwrapped a small, perfectly baked bun from his apron, warm from his oven, and laid it gently on the rough ground. "For Barnaby," he whispered, his voice catching, "for the laughs, and for the peace you found." He felt a strange sense of release, a quiet affirmation that some kindness could still exist, even in a kingdom ruled by fear. He would return secretly, week after week, always with a fresh warm bun, a tiny, defiant offering to the memory of the jester who had defied the king by simply sleeping. Soon, others began to find their way to the unmarked grave. The young stable boy, the one who had watched with wide, innocent eyes from his father's shoulders, would sneak out of the castle stables after his chores were done. He would bring a smooth, brightly colored stone he had found near the river, or a single, perfect feather from a passing bird, and place it carefully on the earth. He didn't fully understand the complex ironies, the political implications. For him it was simply a quiet place for the funny man who had been so tired. He would sit for a while, perhaps hum a fragment of the mouse's lullaby Barnaby had sung, then return to the castle, a small, shared secret weighing gently in his young heart. He would imagine Barnaby, dreaming peacefully beneath the earth, finally free from the king's ill temper and the heavy, wobbling crown. Finnegan Flicka, the bard, a man who understood the enduring power of narrative, became a frequent if discreet visitor. He would come at dawn, when the mist still clung to the thistles, or in the deep hours of the night, his battered lute tucked under his arm. He would never play aloud, for that would draw unwanted attention. Instead, he would simply sit, sometimes for hours, his fingers tracing the phantom chords of his Ballad of the Sleeping Fool on the silent strings of his lute. He reflected on the peculiar genius of Barnaby's final act. It wasn't a grand conscious rebellion, but a profound, almost mystical defiance of the most mundane of human experiences, sleep. Barnaby had, in his unwaking end, given the people of Eldoria a quiet language of resistance, a shared understanding that tyranny, for all its bluster, could be rendered ridiculous by a simple snore. Finnegan felt a deep artistic kinship with the jester. They were both purveyors of inconvenient truths cloaked in humor and melody. He would sometimes whisper new verses he was crafting, verses about the king's sleeplessness, verses about the lasting legacy of Barnaby's peace, testing their rhythm against the silence of the grave, knowing that they would eventually find their way into the tavern, carried by voices emboldened by the jester's spirit. The unmarked grave became a quiet crucible of Eldorian sentiment. It was never a bustling pilgrimage site, never adorned with grand monuments or elaborate offerings that would have attracted the king's vengeful eye. Instead, it remained humble, unassuming, a patch of wild ground where the wind always seemed to whisper a little more gently, and the thistles stood tall, guarding their secret. The offerings were always small, personal, almost ephemeral. A handful of wild berries, a polished stone, a single, perfectly ripe apple, a discarded ribbon, a forgotten toy. Each item was a tiny act of remembrance, a quiet nod of acknowledgement to the jester who had slipped away into eternal slumber, leaving a ripple of unexpected defiance in his wake. It was a place where people came, not to mourn with tears, but to reflect with a quiet, knowing smile. A place where the uneasy laughter that had rippled through the execution crowd could finally find a silent, understanding echo. It was a sanctuary for those who dared to laugh at tyranny, even if only in the privacy of their own thoughts. Standing over the silent resting place of the jester who had quite literally put the king's wrath to sleep, they would stand there, perhaps share a whispered fragment of Barnaby's last joke, and feel a subtle shift within themselves, a strengthening of resolve, a quiet assurance that some things like truth and the power of absurdity could never truly be buried. Meanwhile, in the castle, King Thistlewick III remained trapped in his gilded cage of sleepless torment. The ghost of Barnaby Buttons, the phantom snore, The rearranged crowns, the subtly shortened sleeves, all conspired to deny him peace. He aged rapidly, his face etched with the deep lines of paranoia and chronic exhaustion, his eyes perpetually bloodshot and haunted. He ordered more searches, more arrests, more severe punishments for any perceived slight, any whispered chuckle. But it was like trying to scoop the sea with a sieve. The legend of Barnaby Buttons had taken root too deeply, watered by the king's own disproportionate fury. He was a king, absolute in his power, yet utterly helpless against the memory of a sleeping jester. He would never know of the unmarked grave, of the quiet visits, of the small, defiant offerings. He would never know that the man he had sought to erase had become a symbol of quiet resistance, a perpetual, ironic reminder of his own folly. He would never know that his grand display of power had utterly backfired, leaving him sleepless and tormented, while the man he had condemned enjoyed the most profound, most peaceful rest imaginable. And so, Barnaby Buttons, the jester who took a nap during his own execution, found his final undisturbed rest. His grave remained unmarked, a quiet patch of thistles and wild grass, a silent testament to a life lived in peculiar defiance. But his legacy, the gentle hum of his impossible snore, the quiet echo of his biting wit, the enduring image of his peaceful slumber in the face of death, permeated the very air of Eldoria. It lingered in the nervous chuckles of the common folk, in the knowing glances exchanged in the market square, in the defiant verses of Finnegan Flicker's ballads, and in the hushed conversations by the graveside. He had not sought to be a hero, merely a purveyor of truth through jest. But in his silent, unwaking end, he had become something more enduring, a permanent, ironic monument to the power of laughter against tyranny, and a testament to the fact that even in death, a fool could still have the last, most profound, and most brilliantly unsettling laugh. And for the restless minds of Eldoria, listening to the quiet rustle of the wind and the distant, imagined jingle of a bell, that was a story worth remembering, a truth that offered a strange, comforting sleep.